Hello, friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name's Earl Hutchinson. I'm 52 years old. Been driving trucks for damn near 30 years now. Started when I was fresh out of high school in Anchorage, back when my old man said I needed to learn what real work meant. "Boy," he told me, standing in the kitchen of our little house on Muldoon Road, coffee mug in one hand and the classified ads in the other. "You ain't going to college, and you ain't smart enough for office work, but you got strong hands and a good back. Time you learned how to use them." That was 1991. Ronald Reagan was still fresh in everyone's memory. The Cold War was winding down, and Alaska was booming with oil money and pipeline work. Trucking seemed like a good way to make decent money without having to go underground in the mines or offshore on the rigs. My old man knew a guy who ran a small freight company out of South Anchorage, and before I knew it, I was enrolled in truck driving school and learning how to handle a big rig on Alaska's unforgiving roads. 3 decades later, I'm still behind the wheel, though these days I stick mostly to the Alaska routes. Anchorage to Fairbanks on the Parks Highway, sometimes up the Dalton Highway to Dead Horse when the money's right and the weather cooperates, occasional runs down to Valdez or out to the Kenai Peninsula. It's brutal work, especially in winter when the temperatures drop to 40 below and the wind chill makes it feel like the surface of Mars. But it's honest work, and it's kept food on my table and a roof over my head all these years. The company I work for now is called Northern Express. Been with them for almost 15 years. Before that, I bounced around between smaller outfits, some good, some not so good, a couple that went out of business when the economy took a hit. Northern Express is solid, though. They pay fair wages, maintain their equipment properly, and they don't push drivers to violate safety regulations to make impossible delivery schedules. The owner, a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Eriksson, understands that Alaska trucking is different from hauling freight in the lower 48. Up here, the distances are longer, the weather is more unpredictable, and the consequences of cutting corners can be fatal. I drive a 2018 Peterbilt 389, blue and silver, with a 70-inch sleeper cab and a Caterpillar C15 engine that purrs like a giant mechanical cat when it's properly maintained. I call her Bertha, though I've never been the type to get overly sentimental about machinery. She's got 340,000 miles on her now, but Lars keeps the maintenance schedule tight, and I do my own pre-trip inspections religiously. In this business, especially in Alaska, your truck isn't just your livelihood. It's your lifeline. Break down in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you might not live to tell about it. I've seen my share of weird stuff out here over the years. Alaska's got a way of showing you things that don't make sense, especially when you're driving alone through stretches of nothing for hours at a time. Moose that appear out of nowhere like ghosts, standing in the middle of the highway until your headlights hit them, then vanishing back into the darkness. Weather that changes faster than you can blink. Blue skies 1 minute, whiteout conditions the next. Aurora borealis that'll make you pull over just to stare. Green and purple curtains dancing across the sky like something out of a dream. I've encountered my share of strange people, too. Hitchhikers walking along remote highways in the middle of winter with no proper gear, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they're 15 minutes away from freezing to death. Drifters and prospectors and old sourdoughs who show up at truck stops with wild stories about what they've seen out in the bush. Native elders who speak in riddles and seem to know things about the land that aren't written in any guidebook. Most of the time, you learn to take it all in stride. Alaska is a big, wild place, and it attracts big, wild personalities. The state has always been a refuge for people running from something or toward something, and the isolation and harsh conditions tend to either break people or turn them into something harder and stranger than they were before. After 30 years on these roads, I thought I'd seen it all. But what happened to me last October on Highway 3 between Anchorage and Fairbanks? That's something different. Something that still wakes me up at night, sweating through my sheets, staring at the ceiling and wondering if what I experienced was real, or if I'm finally losing my mind after 3 decades of breathing diesel fumes and listening to CB radio chatter. It was October 15th, 2023. I remember the date exactly because it was a Sunday, and I'd been hoping to catch the football game at Murphy's Pub when I got back to town. The Seahawks were playing the 49ers, and I had $20 riding on Seattle with my buddy Mike Kowalski, who drives for one of our competitor companies. Instead, I got a call from dispatch around 4 p.m., just as I was settling in with a beer and a sandwich to watch the pregame show. "Earl, you there?" It was Diane Kowalski, Mike's wife, actually, who works part-time handling weekend dispatches for Northern Express. Diane's good people, been married to Mike for almost 20 years, knows the trucking business inside and out. "I'm here, Diane," I said, muting the TV. "What's up?" "Emergency run," she said, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "Medical supplies needed up in Fairbanks by Monday morning. Hospital equipment, some kind of specialized diagnostic machinery that can't wait for the regular delivery schedule." I set down my beer and reached for the notebook I keep by the phone. "What's the weight and where's the pickup?" 40,000 pounds, give or take. Pickup's at Advanced Medical Solutions on the south side of town. They're expecting you by 6 p.m. "Sunday premium rates?" I asked, though I was already calculating the drive time in my head. 4 hours to Fairbanks if the weather cooperated, maybe 5 if it didn't. Not a bad run, and Sunday runs usually paid time and a half. "Double overtime," Diane said. "Customers paying emergency rates." That got my attention. Double overtime meant serious money, the kind of money that would cover my truck payment for the month and leave enough left over to get those new tires I'd been putting off. My ex-wife Janet had been on me about the alimony payments again. Seems like every time I get a little ahead financially, she finds a reason to remind me that the divorce settlement isn't just a suggestion, and Bertha needed new tires before winter really set in. The tread was getting thin, and Alaska winters don't forgive trucks with poor traction. "I'll take it," I said. "Give me the details." Diane read me the pickup address and the delivery information. Fairbanks General Hospital, emergency receiving dock, asked for a guy named Patterson who'd be waiting for the shipment. She also gave me the customer contact information and the load number for my logbook. "One more thing, Earl," she said. "Weather Service is calling for a storm system moving in from the Bering Sea, but they say it won't hit until Tuesday. Should be clear sailing for you." "Copy that," I said. "Thanks, Diane." I hung up and looked longingly at my beer and the football pregame show. Mike was going to give me grief about missing the game, especially if Seattle won and I wasn't there to collect my $20. But double overtime was double overtime, and in the trucking business, you take the good runs when they come along. There's always another football game, but there isn't always another paycheck. I grabbed a quick shower, threw some clean clothes and road snacks into my overnight bag, and headed down to the Northern Express yard to pick up Bertha. The yard is located in an industrial area near the port, surrounded by other trucking companies, equipment rental places, and marine supply shops. Not the prettiest part of town, but convenient for freight operations. Bertha was parked in her usual spot near the maintenance bay, clean and fueled and ready to roll. I did my standard pre-trip inspection, checked the tires, the lights, the fifth wheel connection, the airlines, all the safety equipment. Everything looked good. I'd had her in for a full service just the week before, and the mechanics at Northern Express know their business. The pickup at Advanced Medical Solutions went smoothly. The warehouse was a modern facility with good loading docks and professional staff who knew how to handle sensitive equipment. The diagnostic machinery was packed in custom shipping containers, each one clearly labeled with handling instructions and destination information. It took about an hour to get everything loaded and secured, with me checking the load securement straps twice to make sure nothing would shift during transport. The manifest showed exactly what Diane had told me. just over 40,000 pounds of medical equipment, all of it bound for Fairbanks General Hospital. The paperwork was clean, no special permits required, no hazardous materials placards needed. Just a straightforward freight run with an emergency delivery deadline. I pulled out of the advanced medical warehouse around 6:30 p.m., just as the sun was setting over the Chugach Mountains. In mid-October in Alaska, sunset comes early, around 7:30 p.m., and you know you're not going to see daylight again for a long, long time. The park's highway stretched out ahead of me, that familiar ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wilderness like a scar across the landscape. I'd driven this route maybe 500 times over the years, knew every curve, every grade, every truck stop and fuel station between Anchorage and Fairbanks. It's a lonely drive, especially at night, but I'd gotten used to the solitude years ago. Some drivers can't handle the isolation. They need the constant chatter of CB radio or loud music or audiobooks to keep them company. Me, I've always preferred the quiet. Gives you time to think, time to process the events of the day, time to plan for tomorrow. The first hour went smooth as silk. Traffic was light, just a few cars heading north, probably folks getting an early start on their work week. Most of the tourist traffic had dried up by October. The summer visitors had gone back to wherever they came from, leaving Alaska to the people who actually live here year-round. I had the CB tuned to Channel 19, listening to the occasional chatter from other drivers. A guy in a freight liner was complaining about construction delays near Denali Park, but that was still hours ahead of me. Another driver was giving a weather update from the Kenai Peninsula, reporting light snow flurries but good road conditions. Nothing that would affect my route. The temperature was holding steady around 35 degrees, right at the edge of freezing, but not cold enough to create ice on the roads. No precipitation in the forecast until Tuesday, according to the National Weather Service. Perfect conditions for night driving with a heavy load. I stopped for fuel at the big truck stop in Wasilla around 8:30 p.m. It's one of the major stops on the park's highway, with multiple diesel pumps, a decent restaurant, clean restrooms, and a good selection of road snacks and supplies. I topped off both fuel tanks, checked my oil and coolant levels, and grabbed a thermos of coffee and a ham sandwich for the road. While I was fueling up, I ran into another Northern Express driver, a guy named Tommy Nakamura, who I'd worked with off and on for about 10 years. Tommy was heading south with a load of lumber from Fairbanks, said the roads were clear all the way down. "How's it looking up north?" I asked. "Good as it gets for October," Tommy said. "Little bit of fog in the valleys, but nothing you can't handle. Should be a smooth run." We chatted for a few more minutes about company business, recent changes in federal trucking regulations, and the upcoming winter schedule. Tommy mentioned that Lars was looking to hire a couple more drivers for the winter season. Business was picking up with the oil companies gearing up for increased pipeline maintenance work. I climbed back into Bertha around 9 p.m. and got rolling again. The next stretch of highway runs through some of the most beautiful country in Alaska, rolling hills covered with birch and spruce forest, with the Alaska Range visible in the distance on clear days. At night, it's just darkness beyond the reach of your headlights, but you can feel the vastness out there, the weight of all that wild country pressing in around you. Around mile marker 187, just south of Talkeetna, I started noticing the fog rolling in. It came up fast the way it does sometimes in the river valleys, thick white fingers creeping across the highway like something alive. I slowed down from 70 to about 55 miles per hour, flipped on my fog lights, and settled in for a more careful drive. Fog is one of the trickier driving conditions you encounter in Alaska trucking. It's not like snow or ice, where at least you can see what you're dealing with. Fog is deceptive. It can look light and manageable from a distance, then suddenly become thick as cotton when you're in the middle of it. And it tends to come and go in patches, which means your visibility can change from a quarter mile to 10 feet in a matter of seconds. You don't rush when visibility drops like that. not with 40,000 pounds of delicate medical equipment behind you. The load was worth more than my annual salary, and the hospital was counting on it to be delivered in perfect condition. Better to arrive a little late than to arrive with a trailer full of broken equipment because I tried to maintain highway speed in dangerous conditions. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder just outside Talkeetna, right where the fog was thickest. Tall guy, maybe 6'2", wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Had his thumb out, classic hitchhiker pose, though he wasn't making much effort to flag me down, just standing there with his thumb extended, like he knew someone would eventually stop. Now, I don't usually pick up riders. Company policy discourages it for liability reasons, and you never know what kind of trouble you might be inviting into your cab. I've heard stories from other drivers about hitchhikers who turned out to be thieves or worse, people who wait for good Samaritans to stop and then rob them or steal their trucks. It's not common, but it happens often enough to make you cautious. But something about this guy made me slow down. Maybe it was the way he was standing there so still, like he'd been waiting for hours without getting impatient or discouraged. Maybe it was the fog swirling around him, making him look almost ghostly in my headlights. Or maybe it was just that I'd been driving alone for 3 hours and wouldn't mind some company for the long haul ahead. The other thing was the location. Talkeetna is a small town, maybe 800 people, and it's not exactly on the beaten path for casual travelers. Anyone standing on the highway outside Talkeetna at night in October either lived there or had a damn good reason for being there, and if he lived there, he probably knew enough about Alaska survival to not be standing around without proper gear unless he was in genuine trouble. I pulled over about 50 feet past him, air brakes hissing as I brought the big rig to a stop. In my side mirror, I watched him jog up to the passenger door. He moved kind of stiff, like his joints weren't working quite right, but I figured that was probably because he'd been standing in the cold for a while. When he climbed up to the cab door, I got my first good look at him through the window. He was younger than I'd thought from a distance, maybe early 30s, with dark hair and pale skin. Clean-shaven, not like a lot of the drifters and seasonal workers you see thumbing rides out here. His clothes were nice too. Not brand new, but clean and well-maintained. Dark blue jacket that looked like it might be wool, good jeans, decent boots. Not the kind of gear you'd expect from someone who'd been living rough or traveling on a shoestring budget. What struck me most were his eyes. Dark, almost black, and they had this intensity to them, like he was looking right through you to something else, but not in a threatening way, more like he was carrying some heavy thoughts and trying to figure out how to express them. "Thanks for stopping," he said when I rolled down the window. His voice was quiet, polite, with just a hint of what might have been an Alaska accent. "I really appreciate it." "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Fairbanks," he said. "Going home." Well, that was convenient. Same direction I was going, and it would give me someone to talk to during the long stretch through Denali Park and beyond. I told him to climb in, and he did, settling into the passenger seat with a grateful sigh. He was carrying a small duffel bag, olive green canvas, looked like military surplus. He set it down between his feet and buckled his seatbelt. "Name's Danny," he said, extending his hand. "Danny Morrison." "Earl Hutchinson," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, but his skin was cold, really cold, like he'd been standing outside for hours, which he probably had been, given the location and the time of night. "You been waiting long?" I asked as I put the rig back in gear and pulled out onto the highway. "Longer than I'd like," he said with a small smile. "Car broke down about 10 miles back. Cell phone's dead, and you know how it is out here. Not a lot of traffic this time of night." I nodded. I knew exactly how it was. You could be stranded for hours on some of these stretches, especially in weather like this. The fog was getting thicker as we talked, and I could feel the temperature dropping. According to my dashboard thermometer, it was down to 32 degrees, right at the freezing point. "Lucky I came along then," I said. "Yeah. he said, looking out at the fog swirling in the headlight beams. Real lucky. For the first few miles after picking up Danny, we didn't talk much. He sat quietly, looking out the windshield as the fog swirled around us. I had the radio turned down low, just some classic rock station out of Anchorage playing Eagles and Fleetwood Mac, and the CB was quiet except for the occasional burst of static. The fog was making the driving more challenging than I'd expected. It seemed to be getting thicker instead of lighter, and it was starting to freeze on the windshield in thin sheets that the wipers couldn't quite clear. I had to use the windshield washer fluid more frequently than usual, and I bumped the defroster up to high to keep the inside of the glass clear. You drive this route often? Danny asked after we'd been rolling for about 20 minutes. 3-4 times a week, I said. Been doing it for years. Alaska trucking's a small world. Same routes, same stops, same faces at the truck stops and loading docks. Must get lonely, he said. Sometimes, I admitted. But I've gotten used to it. Some drivers need constant noise, constant stimulation. Me, I like the quiet. Gives you time to think. What do you think about? Danny asked, and there was something in his voice, a genuine curiosity, like my answer actually mattered to him. Life, I guess. Family. Things I should have done differently. Things I'm glad I did the way I did them. The usual stuff. Danny nodded. You got family in Anchorage? Ex-wife, I said. Divorced about 8 years ago. No kids. What about you? You from Fairbanks originally? Born and raised, he said. Left for a while, but I'm coming back home now. You know how it is. Alaska gets in your blood. Hard to stay away for long. I knew exactly what he meant. I'd left once myself, back in my 20s, tried to make it in Seattle driving delivery trucks for a beverage distributor. The money was better, and the weather was easier. But I lasted about 2 years before I came crawling back to Alaska. There's something about this place. Something in the vastness and the wildness that gets under your skin. Once you're an Alaskan, you're always an Alaskan, no matter where you go or how long you stay away. What do you do for work? I asked. Danny was quiet for a moment, staring out at the fog. Construction, he said finally. Pipeline work mostly. Just finished a job down in Texas. Ready to get back to real winter, you know. I laughed. Real winter's coming, all right. Weather Service says we might get that first big storm this week. Good, Danny said. I've missed the snow. That was a sentiment I could understand. After spending time in warmer climates, there's something about Alaska winter that starts to feel like home in a way that no other season can match. The silence of a landscape buried under 3 feet of snow, the way the northern lights dance across the star-filled sky, the sense of being connected to something ancient and elemental that modern civilization has mostly forgotten. We drove on through the fog, the miles rolling by under our wheels. The highway was almost empty. We passed maybe 3 vehicles in the next hour, all heading south toward Anchorage. The CB continued to be quiet except for occasional bursts of static and one weather update from a driver somewhere north of us reporting clear skies and good road conditions. Around 10:30 p.m., we passed through the little town of Talkeetna itself. Most of the buildings were dark, the tourist shops and restaurants closed for the season. A few houses showed lights in their windows, and I could see the glow from Mac's Fireside Lounge, which stays open year-round for the locals. But mostly the town looked buttoned up for winter, waiting for the snow to come and transform it into a Christmas card picture. You ever stop in Talkeetna? I asked Danny. Not for a long time, he said. Used to come here as a kid with my folks. My dad liked to fish the Susitna River, and my mom enjoyed browsing the gift shops. Simpler times. There was something wistful in his voice, a note of loss or regret that made me glance over at him. He was still staring out the windshield, but his expression had changed. He looked older somehow, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. "They still around?" I asked. "Your folks?" "I hope so," he said quietly. "That's part of why I'm coming home. I need to make some things right." I didn't push for details. Everyone's got their family drama, their regrets, and unfinished business. Sometimes a long drive gives people the space to talk about things they wouldn't normally discuss, but you can't force it. If Danny wanted to share more about his situation, he would. If not, that was his business. The fog started to lift a little as we gained elevation heading toward Denali Park. I was able to increase speed back to about 60 miles per hour, though I kept a careful eye on the road conditions. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, cold enough that any moisture on the road surface could turn to black ice without warning. "You been away from home long?" I asked. 15 years, Danny said. "Too long." That seemed like a long time to be away, especially if his folks were still alive and living in the same place. But people have their reasons for leaving, and their reasons for coming back. Maybe he'd had a falling out with his family, or maybe work had just taken him to different places. The pipeline construction business tends to move people around a lot. One job in Alaska, the next in Texas or North Dakota or wherever the oil companies happen to be building or maintaining infrastructure. "Must be a big change, coming back after that long," I said. "Everything's different," Danny said. "But also everything's the same, you know? The mountains, the rivers, the way the air smells when it's about to snow. Some things don't change, no matter how much time passes." Around 11:15 p.m., we stopped for fuel at a small truck stop just outside Cantwell. It's not much of a place, just a couple of diesel pumps, a convenience store, and a diner that serves coffee strong enough to wake the dead. But it's one of the few fuel stops on this stretch of highway, and it's always been a reliable place to take a break and check your equipment. Danny said he'd grab us some coffee while I fueled up and did a quick inspection of the load. I walked around the trailer, checking the tie-down straps and making sure nothing had shifted during the first part of the drive. Everything looked good. The medical equipment was riding steady and secure. When Danny came back with 2 large cups and a bag of donuts, I was finishing up my walk-around inspection. The coffee was hot and black, exactly how I liked it, and the donuts were fresh enough to still be warm. "Thanks for this," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You didn't have to pay." "Least I can do," Danny said. "You saved me from a long, cold night on the side of the road." We climbed back into the cab and got rolling again. The fog had mostly cleared now, though there were still patches of low-hanging mist in some of the valleys. The temperature had stabilized at about 25 degrees, cold but not dangerously so. Above us, the sky was clear enough to see stars, and I caught a glimpse of the northern lights beginning to dance along the northern horizon. "Look at that," I said, pointing up at the aurora. Danny followed my gaze and smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all evening. "Beautiful," he said. "I forgot how beautiful it could be." "You don't see that in Texas," I said. "No," he agreed. "You don't see a lot of things in Texas that you see up here." We were making good time now, rolling through the night at a steady 65 miles per hour. The road was mostly straight through this section, cutting across a vast plain dotted with small lakes and patches of forest. In the distance, I could see the outline of Denali, the massive peak glowing faintly in the starlight. "Tell me about pipeline work," I said. "I've hauled equipment up to the North Slope, but I've never actually worked in the industry." Danny seemed happy to have something to talk about. He told me about the different projects he'd worked on, the challenges of construction in extreme climates, the camaraderie among workers who spend months at a time in remote camps. He had good stories, too. Funny incidents involving equipment failures, wildlife encounters, weather delays that turned into impromptu parties. "The money's good," he said, "but it's a hard life. Long hours, dangerous conditions, months away from home, takes a toll on relationships, on your health, on your sense of who you are outside of work. Is that why you're coming back to Alaska? I asked. Getting tired of the life? Danny was quiet for a moment. I'm getting tired of running, he said finally. There comes a time when you have to face the things you've been avoiding, deal with the mistakes you've made. There was something in his voice, a weight of regret or guilt that made me think there was more to his story than just career burnout. But again, I didn't push. We all have our demons, our private struggles that don't make for casual conversation with strangers. Around 12:30 a.m., we passed through Denali Park. The visitor center was dark, closed for the season, but you could see the outline of the mountains in the distance when the clouds broke. The park is 6 million acres of wilderness, home to grizzly bears, wolves, caribou, and Dall sheep. In summer, it's packed with tourists from around the world. In winter, it belongs to the animals and the few hardy souls who work there year-round. Ever been inside the park? I asked Danny. Once, he said, when I was 17. Went camping with some friends the summer before I left home. Good memories? Danny shrugged. Mixed. It was a good trip, but it was also the last time I did something like that with friends from home. After that, everything changed. I sensed there was a story there, but Danny didn't seem inclined to share it. Instead, he started asking me questions about my own background, how I'd gotten into trucking, what I liked about the work, whether I'd ever considered doing anything else. It was the kind of conversation you have on long drives, swapping life stories and killing time while the miles roll by. I told him about growing up in Anchorage, about my father's advice to learn a trade, about the early years when I'd driven for smaller companies that didn't always pay their drivers on time or maintain their equipment properly. I told him about my ex-wife Janet, how the demands of long-haul trucking had contributed to the breakdown of our marriage, about the struggle to find the right balance between work and personal life in a job that requires you to be away from home for days at a time. You ever regret it? Danny asked. The trucking, I mean. Sometimes, I admitted. Especially when I think about what might have been different if I'd chosen another path. But mostly, no. It's been a good life. I've seen a lot of country, met a lot of interesting people, made enough money to live comfortably. Not everyone can say that about their work. What about family? Danny asked. You ever think about starting over? Maybe finding someone new? I'd thought about it, especially in the years immediately after the divorce. But dating is complicated when you're on the road 3 or 4 days a week, and I'd reached an age where I was probably set in my ways. Besides, I'd learned to appreciate the solitude that trucking provides. There's something to be said for a life where your main relationships are with the road, the truck, and the ever-changing landscape outside your windshield. Maybe someday, I said, but I'm in no hurry. What about you? You got someone waiting for you in Fairbanks? Danny shook his head. No, nobody waiting. That's part of the problem, actually. I've spent so much time running from my past that I forgot to build a future. It was approaching 1 a.m. when we started the long climb toward Fairbanks. The highway here cuts through some of the most beautiful country in Alaska, rolling hills covered with birch and spruce forest, wide valleys dotted with small lakes. In summer, it's green and lush and alive with wildlife. In winter, it's buried under snow and transformed into something that looks like the surface of an alien planet. The traffic was almost non-existent now. We hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour, and the CB continued to be quiet except for the occasional burst of static. It was just us and the highway, cutting through the darkness toward our destination. You know, Danny said, breaking a long stretch of comfortable silence. I really appreciate you picking me up tonight. Most drivers wouldn't have stopped. Most drivers are smarter than I am, I said with a laugh. Company policy says we're not supposed to pick up hitchhikers. Liability issues. But you stopped anyway. Yeah, well, sometimes company policy doesn't account for human decency. You looked like you needed help, and I was going in the right direction anyway. Danny nodded. Still, I'm grateful. I was starting to think I might be stuck out there all night. Where exactly did your car break down? I asked. Might be worth calling a tow truck when we get to Fairbanks, see if it's something that can be fixed. Danny was quiet for a moment. It's not worth fixing, he said finally. Old car, more problems than it's worth. I was planning to just abandon it. That seemed odd. Even an old car with mechanical problems usually has some salvage value, and towing companies in Alaska are used to dealing with vehicles that break down in remote locations. But maybe Danny was right. Maybe the car was so far gone that it wasn't worth the cost of towing and repairs. Around 1:30 a.m., we started seeing the glow of Fairbanks in the distance. It's not a big city by lower 48 standards. Maybe 30,000 people in the city proper, maybe double that if you count the surrounding area. But after hours of driving through empty wilderness, those city lights are a welcome sight. Almost home, I said. Yeah, Danny said, but there was something in his voice, a nervousness or uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Almost home. You okay? I asked. You sound a little nervous. Danny gave a weak smile. It's just been a long time. I'm not sure what to expect. I could understand that. Coming home after a long absence can be more stressful than leaving in the first place. People change, places change, and sometimes the home you remember doesn't exist anymore except in your memory. Family know you're coming? I asked. No, Danny said. I wanted it to be a surprise. That could go either way, depending on the circumstances of his departure and the relationships he'd left behind. Surprise homecomings are great in movies, but in real life they can be complicated, especially if there had been unresolved conflicts or hurt feelings. We hit the outskirts of Fairbanks around 2 a.m. The city was mostly asleep, just a few late-night businesses still showing lights. I knew the route to the hospital from memory, north on the Parks Highway, then east on College Road to the medical center. The delivery dock would be open 24 hours for emergency shipments like this. Hospital first, I told Danny. Then I'll run you out to your folks' place. No rush, he said. I've waited this long. Another hour won't matter. The delivery at Fairbanks General went smoothly. The hospital loading dock was well lit and properly staffed, even at this ungodly hour. A guy named Patterson was waiting for me, just like Diane had said he would be. He had a crew of technicians ready to unload the diagnostic equipment and transport it immediately to wherever it was needed. It took about 45 minutes to get everything unloaded and the paperwork completed. I did my usual post-delivery inspection, checking for any damage to the trailer or problems with the truck that might have developed during the trip. Everything looked good. Bertha had performed flawlessly, as she always did when properly maintained. Danny waited in the cab during the whole unloading process, dozing fitfully in the passenger seat. I could see him in the side mirror, head leaning against the window, but his sleep seemed restless. Every few minutes he'd shift position or mutter something under his breath. When I climbed back into the driver's seat, he stirred awake immediately, like he'd been listening for my return. All done? He asked, rubbing his eyes. All done, I confirmed. Now let's get you home. I'd looked up the Steese Highway on my GPS while we were unloading, and I could see the general area Danny had described. The highway ran northeast out of town, crossing the Chena River about 12 miles out. From there, it continued toward central and the old mining country. I figured Birch Lane must be one of those residential roads that branched off toward the older homesteads. You sure you remember how to get there? I asked as we pulled out of the hospital parking lot. It's been 15 years. I could find it blindfolded, Danny said with confidence. Some things you don't forget. We drove through the sleeping city and out onto the Steese Highway. Fairbanks at 3 a.m. is a different place than Fairbanks during the day. The streets are empty except for the occasional police cruiser or snowplow getting ready for the winter season. Most of the businesses are dark, their neon signs turned off for the night. Even the bars had closed by now, leaving only the 24-hour gas stations and the hospital emergency room showing any signs of life. Danny seemed more alert now, sitting up straight and watching the familiar landmarks go by. He pointed out a few places he remembered. A gas station where he used to buy candy as a kid, a small diner that had apparently been his family's favorite place for Sunday breakfast, a bridge over the Chena River where he said he'd caught his first salmon. "Thanks for doing this," he said as we crossed the river bridge. "Most drivers wouldn't go out of their way like this." "No problem," I said. "It's not that far out of my way, and I'm in no hurry to get back to Anchorage." The Steese Highway beyond the river was darker and more isolated than the city streets. Streetlights gave way to forest, and the only illumination came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. This part of the highway serves some of the older residential areas around Fairbanks, places where people built homesteads back when Alaska was still a territory and land was cheap for anyone willing to clear it and work it. "So, what's the plan when you get home?" I asked. "Just knock on the door and surprise them?" Danny was quiet for a moment. "I guess so. I know it sounds crazy, showing up in the middle of the night after 15 years, but I couldn't wait until morning. I've been thinking about this moment for so long, and now that I'm finally here..." "They're going to be shocked," I said. "But probably good shocked. Parents never stop worrying about their kids, no matter how old they get or how long they've been gone." "I hope so," Danny said, but there was still that uncertainty in his voice. "A lot happened before I left. Things were said, feelings were hurt. I'm not sure they'll be happy to see me." "What kind of things?" I asked, then immediately regretted the question. "Sorry, that's none of my business." "It's okay," Danny said. "It was about money, mostly, and responsibility, and the choices I was making. My dad thought I was wasting my life, hanging around with the wrong people, not living up to my potential. He wanted me to go to college, get a degree, make something of myself." "And you didn't want to do that?" Danny shrugged. "I was 18, thought I knew everything. College seemed like a waste of time when I could be making money working construction or in the oil fields. Plus, I was dating this girl my parents didn't approve of, and I was spending too much time partying with friends they thought were bad influences." It was a familiar story. I'd seen it played out dozens of times over the years. Young people in Alaska caught between the traditional expectations of their families and the wild anything-goes culture that the state's boom-and-bust economy tends to create. The oil money and pipeline work attract young men looking to make fast money without college degrees, and the isolation and harsh conditions create a kind of frontier mentality where rules and conventional wisdom don't always apply. "What was the final straw?" I asked. Danny was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the dark forest rolling by outside the passenger window. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Christmas Eve, 1993. I'd been out all night with my friends, drinking and raising hell. Came home drunk around 4 a.m., woke up the whole house. My dad was waiting for me in the kitchen, and he was furious. He said he was tired of my behavior, tired of making excuses for me, tired of watching me throw away every opportunity he'd worked to give me." Danny paused, and I could see him swallow hard in the glow from the dashboard lights. "He said if I couldn't respect his house and his rules, then I wasn't welcome there anymore. Told me to pack my things and get out. Said I could come back when I was ready to grow up and act like a responsible adult." "And you left?" "I left. Packed everything I owned into my car and drove away. I was so angry, so sure that he was wrong and I was right. I thought I'd show him, prove that I could make it on my own without his help or his approval." "But you never went back?" Danny shook his head. "I was too proud, too stubborn. I kept telling myself I'd go back when I'd made something of myself, when I could prove that his way wasn't the only way. But the years kept passing, and it kept getting harder to make that phone call or write that letter. Eventually, it felt like too much time had passed, like too much water had gone under the bridge. I understood that feeling. Pride is a powerful thing, and sometimes it can keep you trapped in patterns of behavior long after they stop making sense. I'd seen it with my own father, who died 5 years earlier without us ever really resolving some of our differences. The older you get, the more you realize that being right isn't always more important than being connected to the people you love. "What changed?" I asked. "What made you finally decide to come home?" Danny was quiet again, and I started to think he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I had a dream about them, about my parents. They were standing in the kitchen of our old house, and they looked exactly the same as they did the last time I saw them. My mother was making coffee, and my father was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, and they were waiting for me." "Waiting for you?" In the dream, I could see them through the window, but I couldn't get inside. I kept trying the door, but it was locked. I knocked and called out to them, but they couldn't hear me. They just kept waiting, like they knew I was coming, but couldn't understand why I wasn't coming inside. Danny's voice had gotten quieter as he told me about the dream, and there was something in his tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just sadness or regret. There was something else, something that sounded almost like fear. "I had that same dream 3 nights in a row," he continued. "And each night they looked a little more worried, a little more sad. Like they were starting to think I might never come home. So you decided to surprise them." "I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I quit my job in Texas, sold everything I owned except what would fit in my car, and started driving north. I've been on the road for 6 days, and all I could think about was getting home before it was too late." "Too late for what?" Danny didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear him over the sound of the diesel engine. "I don't know. I just had this feeling that if I didn't come home soon, I'd lose my chance forever." About 5 miles past the bridge, Danny told me to start watching for Birch Lane on the right side. I slowed down and scanned the roadside, looking for a street sign or a mailbox or anything that might indicate a side road. The area was heavily wooded, with tall spruce and birch trees crowding close to the highway. In the darkness, it was hard to make out much detail beyond what my headlights illuminated. "Should be right around here," Danny said, leaning forward and peering out the windshield. "My dad built our house back in the trees for privacy, but there should be a mailbox by the road." I drove another mile without seeing anything that looked like a residential road or driveway. The GPS showed we were in the right general area, but there were no street signs or markers visible in my headlights. "You sure about the location?" I asked. "Maybe it's a little further up?" Danny frowned, pressing his face closer to the passenger window. "No, it should be right here. I've driven this route 1,000 times. Maybe the sign's down, or maybe they changed the name. Try that opening up ahead." I saw what he was talking about, a gap in the trees that might have been a driveway or a very small road. No sign, no mailbox, just a dirt track disappearing into the woods. It didn't look like much, but then again, a lot of the older homesteads in Alaska are accessed by roads that barely qualify as trails. "You want me to try going up there?" I asked. "I'm not sure I can get this rig turned around if it's a dead end." "Just go slow," Danny said. "If it gets too narrow, I can walk from here. I know these woods." I turned off the highway and onto the dirt track. It was barely wide enough for the truck, with tree branches scraping against the sides of the trailer. The surface was rough, full of potholes and ruts that made the cab bounce and sway. I kept the speed down to maybe 5 miles per hour, watching carefully for any sign that the road was about to narrow even further or that I was approaching a dead end. The track wound through the forest for about a 1/4 mile, climbing gradually uphill and curving to the right. I was starting to worry about getting the big rig turned around when the trees suddenly opened up into a small clearing. What I saw there made me hit the brakes and stare. There were the remains of what might have been a house, a concrete foundation, and some scattered timbers, mostly overgrown with brush and weeds. But it was clearly old, abandoned for years, maybe decades. The foundation was cracked and partially collapsed, and the few remaining pieces of lumber were gray and weathered. Nature had begun the process of reclaiming the site, with small birch and spruce trees growing up through what had once been the floor of the house. "I don't think this is right," I said, turning to Danny. "Looks like this place has been abandoned for a long time." But Danny was staring out at the ruins with an expression I couldn't quite read. His face was pale in the glow of the dashboard lights, and his hands were clenched into fists in his lap. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is home." "Danny, there's nothing here," I said gently. "Maybe you're thinking of a different road. It's easy to get confused in the dark, especially after being away for so long." He shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes off the ruins. "No, this is the place. I recognize that big birch tree over there, and the way the clearing opens up toward the creek. This is definitely it." I looked where he was pointing. There was indeed a large birch tree at the edge of the clearing, its white bark ghostly in my headlights. And now that he mentioned it, I could hear the sound of running water somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing. Probably the creek he'd mentioned. "When's the last time you were here?" I asked carefully. Danny was quiet for a long moment, still staring at the ruins. "Christmas Eve," he said finally. 1993. The night I left. That was 30 years ago. A lot could happen to a place in 30 years, especially out here where the winters are brutal and the summers are short. Buildings could fall down, families could move away or pass on. But still, it seemed odd that there was no trace of recent habitation, no indication that anyone had been here recently to maintain the property or at least keep an eye on it. "Danny," I said gently, "are you sure your folks still live here? 30 years is a long time. Maybe they moved to town, or maybe They're here," he said firmly, but there was a tremor in his voice now. "They have to be here. Where else would they go? This was their home. They built this place with their own hands." I didn't know what to say to that. The clearing was obviously abandoned, had been for years by the look of it. But Danny seemed so certain, so determined to believe that his parents were still here somewhere. Maybe he was in denial about something, or maybe he was confused about the location after all these years away. "Look," I said, "why don't I take you back to town? You can make some phone calls in the morning, check with directory assistants, maybe contact some relatives who might know where your folks are now." But Danny was already reaching for the door handle. "No, they're here. They have to be. I promised I'd come home." "Danny, wait," I said, putting a hand on his arm. "Don't go out there alone. It's dark, and this place looks like it could be dangerous. Rotted boards, maybe old wells or—" But he was already opening the door. "Thanks for the ride, Earl," he said, grabbing his duffel bag. "I really appreciate everything you've done." He climbed down from the cab before I could stop him. I watched him walk toward the ruins, his figure growing smaller and more indistinct in the darkness beyond my headlights. He moved with purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going, despite the fact that there was nothing there but overgrown foundation stones and rotting lumber. He stopped at what might have been the front steps of the old house and stood there for a moment, just looking. Then he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Mom! Dad! I'm home!" The silence that followed was absolute. No response, no movement, just the soft idling of my diesel engine and the whisper of wind through the trees. Danny stood there for what felt like a long time, waiting for an answer that didn't come. Finally, he turned back toward the truck. Even from a distance, I could see that something had changed in his posture. His shoulders were slumped, his head down. He looked defeated, lost. He walked back to the passenger side of the cab and looked up at me through the window. In the harsh glare of my headlights, his face looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. "I guess they're not here," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Danny," I said. "Come on, get back in. We'll figure this out." But he shook his head. "No, I think I'll stay for a while. Look around, see if I can find any clues about where they went. Maybe there's something in the ruins, some indication of what happened." "Danny, you can't stay here," I said. "It's the middle of the night and this place isn't safe. Come back to town with me. We'll find a motel and you can start making inquiries in the morning." "I'll be fine," he said. "I know this place. I grew up here. There's a creek about 100 yards that way where I can get water, and I've got some food in my bag. I just need some time to think, to remember." I didn't like it, but I could see he'd made up his mind. Sometimes people need to process things in their own way, especially when it comes to family and coming home. Maybe a night alone in this place would help him accept that his folks had moved on, or maybe he'd remember some detail that would help him find them. "At least take my card," I said, pulling out one of my business cards and writing my cell phone number on the back. "Call me if you need anything, or if you want to ride back to town." He took the card and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Thanks, Earl. You've been more than kind. I won't forget this." I watched him walk back toward the ruins, then carefully turned the big rig around in the clearing and headed back down the dirt road to the highway. It took some maneuvering to get turned around without backing into the trees, but I managed it. As I drove away, I could see Danny in my side mirror, standing alone in the clearing, a small figure silhouetted against the darkness. The drive back to Anchorage was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about Danny and his situation. Something about the whole thing bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. Maybe it was the way he'd been so certain his folks still lived there, even after 30 years. Maybe it was the sadness in his voice when he talked about the fight he'd had with his father. Or maybe it was just the desolation of that abandoned clearing, the sense of loss and emptiness that seemed to hang over the place like a fog. I got back to Anchorage around 8 a.m. Monday morning and went straight home to my little apartment on the north side of town. I was tired, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Danny standing there in that clearing, calling out for parents who weren't there. Maybe hadn't been there for years. Finally, around noon, I decided to do a little research. I started with the Fairbanks phone directory, looking for any Morrisons in the area. There were a few, but when I called them, none of them knew anything about a Danny Morrison or a family that had lived out on Birch Lane. Next, I tried the Fairbanks city offices, asking about property records for the area where I'd dropped Danny off. The clerk was helpful, but she said their records showed that whole section as undeveloped forest land. According to their maps, there was no Birch Lane, no residential properties, no homesteads in that area. "Are you sure about the location?" she asked. "Sometimes people get confused about road names or property boundaries, especially in the older areas outside town." I gave her the exact coordinates from my GPS and she checked again. Same result. Undeveloped forest land, no residential zoning, no record of any structures ever being built there. That's when I started to get really worried. I called the Alaska State Troopers and reported that I'd dropped off a hitchhiker in what appeared to be an abandoned area and that I was concerned for his safety. They said they'd send a patrol car to check the area, but they warned me that if it was really undeveloped forest land, it might take them a while to locate the exact spot. The trooper called me back around 6 p.m. Trooper Jennifer Walsh, her name was, and she sounded young but professional. "Mr. Hutchinson," she said, "we found the clearing you described, But there was no sign of the individual you dropped off there. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no camping gear. It was as if no one had been there recently. "Are you sure this is where you dropped him off?" she asked. "Positive," I said. "I know exactly where I was. The GPS coordinates match, and I remember the dirt road, the way it curved through the trees, the size and shape of the clearing." "Well, there's definitely evidence of old structures," Trooper Walsh said. "Looks like someone lived there at one time, but it's been abandoned for many years. We found some old foundation stones and rotted lumber, but nothing recent." "Maybe he hiked out to the highway and caught another ride?" I suggested. "Maybe," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. "We'll keep an eye out for him, but if he left the area voluntarily, there's not much we can do. Adults have the right to go where they please, even if it seems like poor judgment." That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept going over the conversation I'd had with Danny, trying to remember every detail. Something was nagging at me, some inconsistency or detail that didn't fit, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Around 3 a.m. it hit me. His clothes. They'd been nice, clean, well-maintained. Not new, but not old either. The kind of clothes you'd wear if you'd just bought them recently, or if you'd been taking good care of them for a long time. But if Danny had been working pipeline construction in Texas, living out of motels and work camps, his clothes should have shown more wear. Construction work is hard on clothing, and men who live on the road for months at a time don't usually have the opportunity or inclination to keep their wardrobes in pristine condition. And his hands? I remembered shaking his hand when he introduced himself. They were soft, not calloused like you'd expect from someone who did heavy construction work. His fingernails were clean and neatly trimmed, his skin smooth except for the cold. After 15 years of pipeline work, a man's hands should tell the story of that labor. There were other things, too. Details that had seemed normal at the time, but now struck me as odd. The way he'd known exactly where to find coffee and donuts at the truck stop, even though he claimed to have been away for 15 years. The way he'd talked about places and landmarks around Fairbanks like he'd seen them recently, not like someone recalling memories from decades ago. The next morning, I drove back to Fairbanks. I told myself I was just making a routine delivery run. I had a load of construction supplies going to a job site north of the city. But really, I wanted to check that clearing again, see if there was any sign of Danny. Maybe he'd left some clue about where he'd gone, or maybe I'd spot something the state trooper had missed. I found the dirt road again without much trouble and drove back to the clearing. In daylight, the place looked even more desolate than it had at night. The foundation of the old house was overgrown with weeds and brush, and what remained of the wooden structures was gray and weathered. It was clear that no one had lived here for many years, maybe decades. I walked around the clearing, looking for any sign that Danny had been there. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed ground where someone might have set up a temporary camp. No evidence of a fire or any other human activity. It was like he'd never existed. I was about to leave when I noticed something I'd missed the night before. There was a small family cemetery about 50 yards from the old house foundation, hidden behind a grove of birch trees. I almost missed it in daylight. It was that overgrown and neglected. I walked through the tall grass and weeds to get a closer look. There were maybe half a dozen graves, each marked with a simple wooden cross or metal marker. Most of the markers were old and weathered, some of them tilted or fallen over entirely. The dates I could make out ranged from the 1940s to the 1990s. I walked through the little cemetery, pushing aside the overgrown vegetation to read the names and dates. Most of them were people I'd never heard of. Thompson, Anderson, Kowalski, names that suggested the old European immigrant families who'd homesteaded this area back in the territorial days. Then I found what I was looking for, and my blood ran cold. James Morrison, 1943-1993. Beloved husband and father. Margaret Morrison, 1947 to 1993. loving wife and mother. Daniel Morrison, 1975 to 1993, cherished son. All three had died in 1993. All three had died on the same day, December 24th, 1993. Christmas Eve. I stood there staring at that last marker for a long time, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Danny Morrison, 1975, 1993. He would have been 18 years old when he died, 30 years ago, almost to the day. According to the dates on the headstones, Danny Morrison had died on Christmas Eve, 1993, the same night he'd told me he'd left home after the fight with his father, and his parents had died the same day. I pulled out my cell phone with shaking hands and called the state troopers again. When Trooper Walsh answered, I could barely get the words out. I think I need to report something about that missing person case, the hitchhiker I dropped off yesterday. What about him, Mr. Hutchinson? There's a cemetery here, graves. I think he's been dead for 30 years. There was a long pause. Sir, are you feeling all right? Maybe you should come in and we can discuss this in person. I gave her the location and waited for her to arrive. When she got there with her partner, I showed them the graves and told them everything I could remember about my conversation with Danny. They took notes and photos, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Finally, Trooper Walsh asked me the question I'd been dreading. Mr. Hutchinson, when's the last time you had a medical checkup? Any history of hallucinations, sleep disorders, medication that might cause confusion? I knew how it sounded. I knew how crazy the whole story was, but I also knew what I'd experienced, and I had one piece of evidence they couldn't explain away. Follow me back to my truck, I said. When we got to where I'd parked Bertha, I opened the passenger door and pointed to something on the floor of the cab. It was a large paper cup from the truck stop in Cantwell, still half full of cold coffee. The cup Danny had bought for himself when we'd stopped for fuel. I didn't put that there, I said. And there's no way it could have been left from a previous trip. I keep my cab clean, and I never leave trash lying around. Trooper Walsh examined the cup carefully, took some photos, and finally sealed it in an evidence bag. We'll run it for fingerprints, she said, though I have to warn you not to expect much. Paper cups aren't the best surface for lifting prints. But she was wrong about that. The fingerprint results came back 2 weeks later. The prints on the cup matched prints on file for Daniel Morrison, who had been reported missing on December 23, 1993, after he'd left his family's home following an argument with his father. According to the police report, Danny had stormed out of the house around midnight on December 23rd, after a heated argument about his behavior and his future. His parents had expected him to cool off and come home by Christmas morning, but he never did. His car had been found 3 days later at the bottom of a steep ravine about 10 miles from the family homestead. The vehicle had gone off the road during an ice storm on Christmas Eve, apparently while Danny was trying to drive back home. He'd died on impact. The report noted that Danny's parents, James and Margaret Morrison, had been devastated by their son's death. They blamed themselves for the argument that had driven him out of the house, and they never recovered from the guilt and grief. On the same day their son's body was found, they had taken their own lives in their home. The property had been abandoned ever since. No relatives had come forward to claim it, and the state had eventually taken possession of the land for back taxes. The house had been left to deteriorate naturally, and nature had slowly begun the process of reclaiming the homestead. Trooper Walsh called me personally with the results. Her voice was quiet, subdued. Mr. Hutchinson, she said, I've been a trooper for 8 years, and I've seen a lot of things I can't explain. But this is something else entirely. What do you think happened? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I think maybe some people get lost between here and wherever they're supposed to go next. And maybe sometimes they need help finding their way home. But why me? Why did he appear to me? I don't know, she said. Maybe because you were the kind of person who would stop to help a stranger. Maybe because you were going in the right direction. Or maybe it was just chance. I never drove the Steese Highway extension again after that. Couldn't bring myself to do it. Even though the rational part of my mind tried to find logical explanations for what had happened, I knew what I'd experienced. I'd given a ride to a man who'd been dead for 30 years. A man who was still trying to get home to parents who'd died of grief over his loss. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't stop thinking about Danny Morrison. I researched the family as much as I could, talked to old-timers in Fairbanks who remembered them, tried to piece together the story of what had happened in that house on Christmas Eve, 1993. What I learned painted a picture of a family destroyed by a moment of anger and pride. James Morrison had been a hard-working man, a carpenter who'd built his family's home with his own hands back in the 1970s. He'd grown up poor in Minnesota and had come to Alaska looking for opportunity and a fresh start. Margaret had been a school teacher, originally from Oregon, who'd met James at a church social in Fairbanks and fallen in love with both him and the wild beauty of Alaska. Danny had been their only child, born when they were in their early 30s and had almost given up hope of having children. By all accounts, he'd been a bright kid, good at sports, popular with his classmates. But like a lot of young men in Alaska in the early 1990s, he'd been seduced by the prospect of easy money in the oil fields and construction sites, and he'd started to drift away from his parents' expectations and values. The people I talked to remembered the family as close-knit and loving, which made the tragedy even more heartbreaking. If James Morrison hadn't lost his temper that night, if Danny hadn't been so stubborn and proud, if the ice storm hadn't hit just as Danny was driving back to apologize, any one of those factors might have changed the outcome. Instead, a family that loved each other was destroyed by a perfect storm of bad timing, harsh words, and unforgiving weather. The more I learned about the Morrison family, the more I understood why Danny's spirit might still be wandering, still trying to get home. He'd died before he could make things right with his parents, before he could apologize for the hurtful things he'd said, before he could prove to them that their love and guidance had mattered to him after all. And his parents had died believing that they'd failed as parents, that their last conversation with their son had been an angry one, that he'd died thinking they didn't love him. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving the lonely stretches of Alaska Highway, I think about Danny Morrison. I hope he found his way to wherever he was supposed to be. I hope he finally made it home to the people who loved him, even if it took 30 years and the kindness of a stranger to get him there. But I also think about the lessons his story teaches, about the importance of not letting pride and anger drive wedges between the people we love, about the danger of assuming there will always be time to apologize, to make things right, to say the words that need to be said. I think about my own relationship with my father, how we'd had our differences over the years but had always managed to work them out before it was too late. And I think about my ex-wife Janet, how even though our marriage didn't work out, we'd managed to end things without the kind of bitter recriminations that might have haunted us for years. Not everyone is that lucky. Sometimes people die with things left unsaid, with relationships left unrepaired, with love left unexpressed. And maybe sometimes, those unfinished stories create a kind of spiritual gravity that keeps souls anchored to the places and people they can't quite leave behind. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Not ever. Because sometimes the people standing on the side of the road aren't looking for a ride to where they're going. Sometimes they're looking for a ride to where they've already been, and that's a journey I'm not prepared to take again. The coffee cup that Danny bought that night is still in evidence storage somewhere in Fairbanks. filed away with all the other inexplicable things that happen in this vast, wild state. But I don't need physical proof to know what happened that night. I know I gave a ride to a ghost, helped a lost soul find his way to a home that existed only in memory and longing. Alaska is a big place, full of stories that don't make sense to people from the outside. Stories of things seen in the wilderness, of voices heard on the wind, of encounters that defy explanation. Most folks down in the lower 48 would dismiss such things as frontier superstition or the product of too much isolation and too little human contact. But those folks have never driven alone through the Alaskan night, never felt the weight of all that emptiness pressing down around them. They've never stopped to help a stranger on a dark highway and found themselves part of a story that began decades before they were born. I'm 52 years old now, and I've been driving these roads for 30 years. I've seen the aurora borealis dance across the sky like the spirits of the dead, felt the earth shake beneath my wheels during the big earthquakes, watched the seasons change from endless winter darkness to endless summer light and back again. This country gets into your blood, becomes part of who you are, and it never lets you go. But it also teaches you that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, as the old saying goes. It teaches you that the line between the living and the dead isn't always as clear as we'd like to think. And it teaches you that sometimes the greatest kindness you can show a stranger is to help them find their way home, even if home is a place that exists only in memory and in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Danny Morrison found his way home that night. I'm sure of it. And maybe that's all any of us can hope for in the end. That when our time comes, when we're the ones standing on the side of the road with our thumb out, someone will stop and give us that ride. Because in the end, we're all just trying to get home. Even now, 5 months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking about that drive. I remember the weight of the fog pressing down around the truck, the way Danny's voice sounded when he talked about coming home, the absolute stillness of that abandoned clearing when I left him there. But mostly I remember the coffee cup. That paper cup with Danny's fingerprints on it sits in an evidence locker in Fairbanks. A piece of physical proof that something impossible happened on a foggy October night. The state troopers don't know what to do with it. It doesn't fit into any category of evidence they're trained to handle. How do you file a report about a ghost who bought coffee at a truck stop? Trooper Walsh has become something of an unofficial expert on unexplained phenomena in Alaska. She tells me that my case isn't unique, that the state gets reports of similar incidents several times a year. Hitchhikers who disappear, drivers who give rides to people who turn out to have been dead for years, passengers who know things about places they've never been or remember events that happened before they were born. Alaska's different, she told me during one of our conversations. The distances, the isolation, the extremes of weather and light and darkness. Maybe all of that creates conditions where the normal rules don't always apply. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, the knowledge that I experienced something that can't be explained by any rational framework I understand. It's changed me in ways I'm still figuring out. I'm more careful about the words I speak in anger, more conscious of the relationships I might be taking for granted. I call my ex-wife more often than I used to, not because I want to get back together, but because life is short and unpredictable, and sometimes people don't get second chances to say what needs to be said. I've also become something of an informal counselor for other drivers who've had similar experiences. Word gets around in the trucking community, and every few months someone will seek me out at a truck stop or call the company asking to speak with that driver who picked up the ghost. They want to tell their own stories, to talk to someone who won't look at them like they're crazy or suggest they need professional help. There's Jimmy Kowalski, who swears he gave a ride to a woman in a white dress who turned out to have died in a car accident on the same stretch of highway 20 years earlier. There's Maria Santos, who picked up an elderly native man outside of Talk who spoke to her in perfect English about places she'd never been, then vanished from her passenger seat while she was stopped at a rest area. There's Bob Fletcher, who found a child's toy in his cab after giving a ride to a family that, according to local records, had perished in a house fire decades before he was born. The stories are all different, but they share common elements. Isolated highways, fog or bad weather, passengers who seem ordinary until you start noticing the details that don't quite add up, and always some small piece of physical evidence left behind. A coffee cup, a hair ribbon, a toy, a piece of paper with writing on it. Proof that something happened, even if we can't explain what. I've started keeping a journal of these encounters, partly for my own peace of mind and partly because I think someone should be documenting these experiences. Maybe someday, someone smarter than me will be able to make sense of the pattern, to understand what creates the conditions that allow the dead to hitchhike rides from the living. Or maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is simpler than that. Maybe the point is just that love doesn't end when life does. That the bonds between people can be stronger than death, stronger than time, stronger than the physical laws that are supposed to govern how the world works. Maybe Danny Morrison appeared on that highway because his love for his parents was so strong that it created a kind of beacon, a signal that called out across 30 years of separation to find someone who could help him get home. I think about that a lot these days, especially when I'm driving alone through the long Alaska nights. I think about the power of unfinished business, the weight of words left unspoken, the gravity of love that refuses to be contained by something as simple as death. And I think about the fact that, in some cosmic sense, I was exactly where I needed to be on that October night. That out of all the drivers who might have been on that stretch of highway at that particular moment, Danny Morrison found the one who would stop, who would listen, who would take him home, even though home turned out to be a place that existed only in memory and grief. There's a responsibility that comes with that realization, a sense that I was chosen for this role in some story much larger than my own understanding. I don't know why I was selected to be Danny's last ride home, but I'm honored that I was. In a small way, I was able to help heal a wound that had been bleeding for 30 years. To close a circle that had been left open since Christmas Eve, 1993. These days, I drive different routes than I used to. I've asked dispatch to keep me on the shorter hauls, the daytime runs, the trips that don't take me through the lonely stretches of highway where the fog rolls in thick and the boundaries between worlds become thin. It's not that I'm afraid, though there are moments, usually late at night, when I remember the absolute coldness of Danny's hand and feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. It's more that I feel like I've served my purpose in whatever cosmic system governs these encounters. I gave Danny Morrison his last ride home, helped him find his way back to the people who loved him, allowed him to finally complete the journey he'd started 30 years ago on a frozen Christmas Eve. Maybe now it's someone else's turn to stop for the stranger standing on the side of the road. Someone else's turn to offer a ride to a passenger who needs to get home more than they need to stay in the world of the living. But I still think about that night, and I still wonder about the larger questions it raises. If Danny Morrison could hitchhike a ride across 30 years of death, who else might be out there, walking along the highways and back roads of Alaska, waiting for someone to stop? How many unfinished stories are still playing out in the spaces between what we can see and what we can understand? Sometimes, when I'm driving through areas where I know tragedies have occurred, stretches of highway known for fatal accidents, towns where murders or disappearances have left families without closure, I find myself watching the roadside more carefully than I used to. Not because I want to pick up another ghostly passenger, but because I've learned that the dead don't always stay dead, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to help them find their way to where they're supposed to be. Alaska is full of unfinished stories. It's a place where people come to start over, to escape their pasts, to find something they've lost or never had. But it's also a place where the past has a way of catching up with you, where the ghosts of old choices and missed opportunities can manifest as real as the aurora borealis dancing across the winter sky. I've made my peace with being part of one of those stories. I've accepted that on one foggy October night, I became a minor character in a drama that began before I was born and concluded in ways I still don't fully understand. I gave Danny Morrison a ride home, and in doing so, I learned something about the persistence of love, the power of unfinished business, and the thin line that separates the world of the living from whatever comes after. The Alaska highway stretches on, empty and endless under the northern stars. And somewhere out there, in the space between what we know and what we can never understand, the dead are still traveling, still searching, still hoping to find their way home. I just pray that when my time comes, when I'm the one standing on the side of the road with my thumb out, someone will stop and give me that ride. Because in the end, we're all just trying to get home, whether we're alive or dead. Whether home is a place we can touch or a place that exists only in the geography of memory and love. And sometimes, getting home requires the kindness of strangers who are willing to drive into the unknown, to pick up passengers who carry stories larger than themselves, to become part of something they don't understand but can't ignore. Danny Morrison found his way home that night. I helped him get there, and in doing so, I learned that home isn't always a place you can find on a map. Sometimes home is the place where you're forgiven, where you're welcomed back despite your mistakes, where love waits patiently for you to find your way back to where you belong. Even if it takes 30 years, even if it requires a stranger to give you that final ride. Even if home exists only in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the moment when time stops and love conquers death, and all the broken pieces of a family are finally made whole again. That's what I believe happened on that foggy October night. That's the story I carry with me now as I drive the highways of Alaska, watching for hitchhikers, listening for voices on the wind, knowing that somewhere out there, someone else might need a ride home. And when that time comes, I hope I'll have the courage to stop, to offer a helping hand to a stranger, to become part of a story larger than my own understanding. Because that's what we owe each other in this brief, mysterious journey we call life. The willingness to help each other find our way home, no matter how far we've traveled or how long we've been lost. The road goes on forever, winding through wilderness and memory, through the land of the living and the country of the dead. And somewhere along that endless highway, love is waiting to guide us home. My name is Frank Kowalski, and I've been running ice roads in Alaska for 26 years. Not many people can say that and still be breathing, let alone walking around with all their fingers and toes intact. The ice road trucking business is about as dangerous as civilian work gets. You're hauling 60,000-pound loads across frozen lakes and rivers that might give way without warning, in temperatures that can drop to 60 below zero, through whiteout blizzards that can swallow a man and his truck without leaving so much as a tire track behind. I'm 47 years old now, and I've been driving trucks since I got out of the Army in 1999. Did 2 tours in Afghanistan as a motor transport operator, learned how to handle heavy vehicles in hostile conditions where a mechanical breakdown or a wrong turn could get you killed. When I came back stateside, civilian trucking seemed like easy money compared to dodging IEDs on the roads outside Kandahar. But Alaska ice road trucking? That's a different beast entirely. Most people know about ice road trucking from those TV shows that made it look glamorous and exciting. They don't show you the months of isolation, the constant fear that this might be the load where your luck runs out, the way the extreme cold gets into your bones and stays there for months after the season ends. They don't show you the drivers who just disappear, swallowed up by the wilderness, their rigs found weeks later with no sign of what happened to the man behind the wheel. I work for Polar Express Logistics, one of the bigger outfits that services the oil fields and mining operations up north. Based out of Fairbanks, we handle supply runs to some of the most remote locations in Alaska, places where the only access is by ice road during the few months of the year when the lakes and rivers freeze solid enough to support loaded semis. The rest of the year, these locations are cut off from the outside world except for emergency supply flights that cost more per pound than most people make in a day. The season typically runs from late December through early April, depending on weather conditions and ice thickness. Every year it's different. Some winters the ice forms thick and early, giving us a long season to make our money. Other years, climate change and unpredictable weather patterns cut the season short, leaving drivers scrambling to make enough to carry them through the off-season. I specialize in the Dalton Highway corridor and the ice roads that branch off from it. The James Dalton runs north from Livengood to Deadhorse, following the route of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline through some of the most brutal terrain on the continent. It's a 400-mile journey through wilderness so remote that a breakdown can turn into a survival situation in minutes. During ice road season, we use that highway as a jumping-off point to reach mining camps, oil exploration sites, and research stations that can only be supplied by truck during the winter months. My rig is a 2019 Kenworth W900, specially modified for ice road work. Extended-range fuel tanks, auxiliary heating systems, reinforced transmission and differential, special low-temperature tires with aggressive tread patterns. The cab is equipped with survival gear that could keep me alive for a week if I had to abandon the truck. Cold weather sleeping bag rated to -40, emergency food and water, satellite communication equipment, flare gun, the works. In this business, your truck isn't just your livelihood, it's your life support system. I've been through some situations over the years that would make your hair stand on end. I've had the ice crack beneath my wheels and felt the truck settle as water started seeping up through the fissures, forcing me to gun the engine and pray I could reach solid ground before the whole surface gave way. I've driven through blizzards so thick I couldn't see the hood of my own truck, navigating by GPS and faith and the faint pressure ridges in the snow that marked where other trucks had passed. I've spent nights stranded in temperatures so cold that diesel fuel turns to gel and rubber becomes brittle as glass. But what happened to me during the winter of 2023 on a run to a remote mining operation called Gold Creek Station was different from anything I'd experienced before. It was the kind of incident that makes you question everything you think you know about how the world works. The kind of story that other drivers listen to with skeptical expressions until you show them the proof you brought back with you. It started on February 18th, 2024. I remember the date exactly because it was my ex-wife Linda's birthday, and I'd been dreading the day for weeks. Not because I still had feelings for her, mind you, but because our divorce settlement required me to pay her alimony, and the payments were always due on the 15th of each month. I was 3 days late with February's payment because a previous job had paid out slower than expected, and I knew she'd be calling her lawyer if I didn't get caught up soon. The Gold Creek run came up at exactly the right time. Polar Express dispatcher Charlie Marsh called me around 6 a.m. with an emergency load, mining equipment and supplies that needed to get to Gold Creek Station before a storm system moved in from the Bering Sea. The operation was shutting down for the season, and they needed this equipment to winterize their facilities and secure the site until spring. "It's a good-paying run, Frank," Charlie told me over the phone. "Premium rates because of the weather window and the isolation factor. But I'm not going to lie to you. The forecast looks dicey. Weather Service is calling for a major storm to hit the region starting tomorrow night." I asked him about the route and the ice conditions. Gold Creek Station was about 180 miles northeast of Fairbanks, accessible only by a ice road that branched off from the Dalton Highway near Coldfoot. The first 100 miles followed established routes that were regularly maintained and monitored for ice thickness. But the final 80 miles were what we call Pioneer Road, routes that are basically just GPS coordinates and local knowledge, maintained by the mining company itself rather than the state transportation department. Ice reports from last week show good conditions, Charlie said. 18 to 20 inches on most of the route, which should be plenty for your gross weight. But Frank, this is a solo run. No convoy, no escort vehicle. If you get into trouble out there, help might be a long time coming. I thought about Linda's alimony payment, about the bills stacking up on my kitchen table, about the fact that ice road season was already more than half over, and I needed every high-paying run I could get. The smart thing would have been to pass on the job, wait for better weather and a safer route. But smart doesn't always pay the bills. "What's the window?" I asked. "You need to be loaded and rolling by noon if you want to make it there and back before the storm hits." Customer contact is a guy named Bill Henderson. He's the site foreman. Been expecting this shipment for 2 weeks. I told Charlie I'd take the job, then spent the next 3 hours getting ready. Ice road runs require more preparation than regular freight hauling. You check and double-check everything because there are no truck stops or repair shops where you're going, no cell phone coverage, no CPA to call if things go wrong. You're completely on your own out there, and a small mechanical problem can quickly become a life-threatening emergency. The load was waiting for me at a warehouse on the south side of Fairbanks. 40,000 pounds of mining equipment, generators, fuel pumps, electrical components, and supplies. Everything was crated and secured according to ice road specifications, with extra strapping and padding to handle the rough conditions. I did my pre-trip inspection twice, checking tire pressure, fluid levels, battery condition, heating systems, and all the safety equipment. By 11:30 a.m. I was fueled up and ready to roll. The temperature was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit with light snow falling, but the wind was calm and visibility was good. According to the latest weather reports, I had about 30 hours before the storm system reached the area. Plenty of time to make the delivery and get back to civilization. The first part of the drive was routine. The Dalton Highway from Fairbanks to Coldfoot is well maintained during ice road season, with regular patrols by state transportation crews and sufficient traffic to keep the route packed down. I made good time, averaging about 50 miles per hour, which is fast for ice road conditions but well within safe limits for the load I was carrying. I stopped for fuel and a quick equipment check at Coldfoot around 4 p.m. It's one of the few services available along the Dalton Highway. A truck stop, small restaurant, and basic repair facility that caters to ice road drivers and pipeline workers. The place was busy with other truckers preparing for runs or coming off the ice, sharing information about conditions and weather reports. "You heading out to Gold Creek?" asked a driver I recognized, a veteran ice road trucker named Mike Peterson who worked for one of our competitor companies. "That's the plan," I said. "You been up that way recently?" Mike shook his head. "Not since last month, but I talked to a guy yesterday who said the ice was good, maybe a little rough in places, but nothing an experienced driver can't handle. You better not waste any time, though. That storm they're forecasting looks like a real monster." I grabbed a thermos of coffee and a couple sandwiches from the restaurant, topped off my fuel tanks, and got back on the road. The turnoff for the Gold Creek Ice Road was about 20 miles north of Coldfoot, marked only by a small sign and a set of tire tracks disappearing into the wilderness. This is where ice road trucking gets really interesting. You leave behind any pretense of civilization and head out onto frozen lakes and rivers that exist as highways for only a few months each year. The route to Gold Creek Station was actually a series of connected ice roads, across Koyukuk Lake, down the frozen Dietrich River for about 15 miles, then across a chain of smaller lakes toward the foothills of the Brooks Range. The ice road itself was in good condition, with packed snow providing decent traction and reflective markers every quarter mile to help with navigation. but it was also completely isolated. I didn't see another vehicle or any sign of human activity for the first 2 hours of the run. Just endless white landscape stretching away in all directions, broken only by the dark line of the ice road cutting across the frozen terrain. The sun sets early in Alaska in February. By 5:30 p.m. it was full dark, and I was driving by headlight through a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. The aurora borealis was active that night, green and purple curtains of light dancing across the star-filled sky, reflecting off the snow and ice in ways that could trick your eyes into seeing movement where there was none. Around 7 p.m., I reached the halfway point of the ice road route, a small emergency shelter maintained by the mining company for drivers who needed to stop and warm up or deal with mechanical problems. It was just a tiny plywood building with a diesel heater and basic supplies, but it represented the only human presence for 50 miles in any direction. I stopped to check my load securement and grab a quick bite to eat. Everything looked good. The cargo was riding steady, the truck was performing flawlessly, and I was making better time than expected. According to my GPS, I should reach Gold Creek Station by 9 p.m., plenty of time to unload and start the return trip before midnight. That's when I made the mistake that changed everything. Instead of staying on the main ice road route, I decided to take a shortcut that was marked on my GPS as a seasonal road. It appeared to cut about 20 miles off the total distance, running more directly toward the mining station instead of following the longer but safer route around the chain of lakes. In ice road trucking, shortcuts are almost always a bad idea. The main routes are surveyed and maintained for a reason. They follow the areas where ice thickness is most reliable, where the underlying terrain provides the best support, where rescue operations can be mounted if something goes wrong. But I was feeling confident. The weather was holding steady, and 20 miles saved meant I'd be back to Fairbanks hours earlier than planned. The shortcut started out fine. The surface was rough, with more snow cover than the main route, but the ice felt solid beneath the wheels, and the truck was handling the conditions without problems. For the first 10 miles, I congratulated myself on making a smart decision. Then the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, like someone had thrown a switch. One minute I was driving under clear skies with good visibility, and the next minute I was in the middle of a ground blizzard with wind speeds that had to be over 50 miles per hour. The snow wasn't falling from above. It was being picked up from the surface and hurled horizontally by the wind, creating a whiteout condition so complete that I couldn't see the hood of my own truck. I slowed to a crawl, trying to follow what I hoped was still the ice road, but quickly realizing I was in serious trouble. The wind was strong enough to rock the loaded truck, and the blowing snow was accumulating on my windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. Worst of all, I'd lost the reflective markers that marked the safe route. Either the shortcut wasn't as well maintained as the main road, or the blowing snow was obscuring them. After about 20 minutes of driving blind, I made the decision to stop and wait out the storm. Continuing to move in zero visibility was suicidal. I could drive off the ice road into soft snow, break through thin ice, or simply get so lost that I'd never find my way back to the marked route. I pulled over as far as I dared from what I hoped was the center of the road and shut down the engine. The sudden silence was eerie after hours of diesel noise and wind buffeting. I could hear the storm raging outside, but inside the cab it was warm and secure. I had enough fuel to run the auxiliary heater for days if necessary, plenty of food and water, and satellite communication equipment to call for help if the situation became desperate. The plan was to wait for the storm to pass, then use GPS to navigate back to the main ice road route. Simple, safe, professional. What I didn't anticipate was that the storm would last for 3 days. It was like nothing I'd experienced in 26 years of driving Alaska roads. The wind never dropped below 40 miles per hour, and the snow was so thick that day and night became meaningless concepts. I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windshield, couldn't tell if I was on ice or land, Couldn't get any reference points to determine my exact location. By the second day, I was starting to worry about fuel consumption. The auxiliary heater was efficient, but it still consumed diesel, and I needed to maintain enough fuel to reach the nearest station once I got moving again. I rationed the heat, keeping the cab just warm enough to prevent hypothermia, and tried to sleep as much as possible to conserve energy. On the third day, the satellite communicator finally picked up a signal long enough for me to send a brief message to Polar Express Dispatch. Stranded in storm near Gold Creek route. Truck operational. Will attempt to move when weather clears. The response came back within minutes. Major storm system. All rescue operations suspended until conditions improve. Shelter in place. It was the afternoon of the third day when the storm finally began to weaken. The wind dropped to maybe 20 miles per hour, and the horizontal snow turned back into normal falling snow. For the first time in 72 hours, I could see more than a few feet beyond the truck. What I saw didn't make any sense. I wasn't on an ice road. I wasn't even on a lake or river. I was parked in what appeared to be the parking lot of a truck stop, a real building with lights in the windows and smoke coming from a chimney. There were other trucks parked around me, maybe a dozen big rigs with snow piled up around their wheels like they'd been there for a while. I sat in my cab for several minutes, trying to figure out how this was possible. According to my GPS, I should have been in the middle of wilderness, at least 50 miles from the nearest building. But there it was, a truck stop that looked like it had been operating for years, complete with fuel pumps and what appeared to be a restaurant or cafe. The logical explanation was that I'd gotten more lost than I'd realized during the storm, that I'd somehow found my way to a facility that wasn't marked on my maps. It wouldn't be the first time GPS proved unreliable in remote areas of Alaska, where satellite coverage can be spotty and electronic equipment sometimes malfunctions in extreme cold. I climbed out of the cab, grateful to stretch my legs after 3 days of confinement. The cold hit me like a physical blow. It had to be at least 40 below zero, cold enough that my breath froze instantly and the air itself seemed to have weight and substance. But the truck stop looked warm and welcoming, yellow light spilling out of the windows and onto the snow-covered parking lot. The sign above the building read Mile 67 Truck Stop, which didn't match any location I could remember from my route maps. But truck stop signs aren't always reliable. They change names, change ownership, sometimes reflect old highway designations that haven't been updated in years. What mattered was that it was shelter, warmth, and possibly communication equipment to let dispatch know I was safe. I walked toward the main building, my boots crunching in snow that squeaked with the special sound of extremely cold temperatures. As I got closer, I could see through the windows into what appeared to be a typical truck stop cafe. Booths and tables, a lunch counter, men in heavy winter clothing drinking coffee and eating meals. The door was heavy wood with a brass handle, and it opened with the kind of solid thunk that suggested quality construction. A blast of warm air hit me as I stepped inside, along with the familiar smells of coffee, bacon, and diesel fuel that characterize truck stops everywhere. What struck me immediately was how quiet the place was. There were maybe 15 men sitting at various tables and booths, all wearing heavy winter clothing, all eating or drinking in near complete silence. The only sounds were the clink of silverware against plates and the hiss of air brakes from trucks in the parking lot. The decor was dated in a way that seemed intentionally nostalgic. Wood-paneled walls, red vinyl booth seats, a lunch counter with chrome trim that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. The cash register was an old mechanical model, the kind where you had to pull a lever to open the drawer. Even the coffee maker looked like something from decades past. "You just get in?" asked the man behind the counter. He was maybe 60 years old, with gray hair and the kind of deep tan that comes from spending time outdoors in reflected sunlight. His name tag read Bill. "Been stuck in the storm for 3 days," I said, grateful to be talking to another human being. "Didn't expect to find a truck stop out here." Bill nodded as if this was perfectly normal. Storm was a bad one. We get truckers coming in off the ice roads all the time, especially when the weather turns. You want coffee? Food? I said yes to both and took a seat at the counter. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what I needed after 3 days of rationing my thermos. I looked around at the other drivers, expecting the usual nods and casual conversation that characterizes truck stop culture, but they all seemed focused on their meals, speaking in whispers if they spoke at all. Busy place, I commented to Bill. Always is during ice road season, he said, pouring me a fresh cup of coffee. Lot of drivers running freight up to the mining operations and oil fields. Dangerous work, especially with weather like we've been having. I asked him about the location, trying to figure out exactly where I was in relation to my planned route. Bill was vague about the details, saying only that they were along the northern corridor and that most drivers found them when they needed to, especially during bad weather. You got a phone I can use? I asked. Need to call my dispatcher, let them know I'm okay. Phone's been out for a couple days, Bill said. Storm knocked down some lines. Should be back up soon. I spent about an hour in the cafe drinking coffee and eating a surprisingly good cheeseburger while trying to make sense of my situation. The other drivers gradually left, heading back to their trucks or disappearing into what I assumed were sleeping quarters. None of them had spoken to me directly, though I'd caught a few studying me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head back to my truck and try to get some sleep. I'd been running on adrenaline and caffeine for 3 days, and I needed rest before attempting to find my way back to the main ice road route. Bill told me I was welcome to stay as long as I needed, that the truck stop was used to hosting stranded drivers during the winter months. What do I owe you for the meal? I asked. Bill waved off the question. Company policy. No charge for drivers caught in emergency situations, just part of the service. I walked back to my truck through the bitter cold, passing several other rigs parked in the lot. Most of them looked older than mine, with a lot of wear and customization that suggested they belonged to veteran drivers. But something about them seemed off in a way I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the style of the modifications, or the fact that they all seemed to be covered with more snow than 3 days of storm should have produced. Back in my cab, I tried the satellite communicator again, but I couldn't get a signal. That wasn't unusual. The equipment was finicky in extreme cold, and the surrounding terrain might have been blocking satellite reception. I made notes in my logbook about the truck stop and my current situation, then settled in for the night. I woke up around 6 a.m. to the sound of diesel engines starting up in the parking lot. Through my windshield, I could see other drivers doing their pre-trip inspections and preparing to hit the road. The storm had completely cleared, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white snow under a brilliantly clear sky. I did my own pre-trip inspection, checking for any damage from the storm or problems that might have developed during 3 days of stationary operation. Everything looked good. The truck had weathered the blizzard without any apparent issues. My GPS was functioning normally again, though it showed my current location as simply remote area without identifying the truck stop or providing specific coordinates. I went back into the cafe for breakfast and to ask Bill about the best route to rejoin the main ice road. The place was busier than it had been the night before, with maybe 20 drivers eating breakfast and drinking coffee. The atmosphere was the same as before, quiet, almost subdued, with minimal conversation. You heading back to civilization? Bill asked as he poured my coffee. That's the plan, I said. I need to get to Gold Creek Station to make my delivery, then head back to Fairbanks. Bill frowned. Gold Creek Station? That place shut down years ago. Mining company pulled out after they exhausted the placer deposits. That didn't match the information I'd been given by my dispatcher, but mining operations do shut down and restart based on commodity prices and geological surveys. Maybe the delivery had been canceled while I was stranded. Or maybe Bill was thinking of a different operation. When did they shut down? I asked. Oh, must be 15, 16 years ago now, Bill said casually. Happened right around the time the Exxon Valdez spill killed the fishing industry. A lot of operations scaled back after that. I stared at him. The Exxon Valdez oil spill had happened in 1989, 35 years ago. If Gold Creek Station had shut down 15 or 16 years after that, it would have been closed since the mid-1990s. But my dispatcher had specifically told me they were expecting a delivery, that the site foreman Bill Henderson was waiting for the equipment I was carrying. Are you sure about that? I asked. My company has a current contract with Gold Creek Station. I'm supposed to deliver mining equipment to a guy named Bill Henderson. Bill's expression didn't change, but I noticed that conversations at nearby tables had stopped. Several drivers were looking in our direction, though they quickly looked away when I met their eyes. Maybe you're thinking of a different operation, Bill said. There's a lot of mining activity in the region. Easy to get the names confused. I asked him about directions back to the main ice road, and he gave me vague instructions about following the valley floor toward the southeast until I picked up the markers for the established route. It wasn't very specific, but I had GPS coordinates for my destination, and I figured I could navigate by dead reckoning if necessary. I paid for breakfast. Bill accepted payment this time, though he insisted on 1987 prices that seemed absurdly low, even accounting for the remote location. Then I headed back to my truck to begin what I hoped would be the final leg of my journey to Gold Creek Station. As I walked across the parking lot, I passed several of the other trucks and got a better look at them in daylight. What I saw made me stop and stare. They were all older models, some of them 20 or 30 years old, but they were in pristine condition. Not just well-maintained, but perfect. No rust, no wear, paint jobs that looked like they'd been applied yesterday. The license plates were current, but they were all from 1987. I checked plate after plate, thinking I must be misreading the registration stickers. But they all showed the same thing. Alaska commercial vehicle registrations, all issued in 1987, all apparently valid and current according to the stickers. That was impossible. Vehicle registrations expire annually, and there's no way a 1987 registration could still be valid in 2024. Either these trucks had been sitting in this parking lot for 37 years without being moved, or something very strange was happening. I started looking more closely at the details. The trucks themselves represented a range of manufacturers and model years, but they all shared certain characteristics. The paint was too perfect, the chrome too bright, the tires too new for vehicles that should have been decades old. And they were all configured for ice road work, with the same kinds of modifications and equipment that modern ice road trucks carry. More disturbing was the fact that none of them showed any signs of the storm we'd just been through. My truck was covered with accumulated snow and ice from 3 days of blizzard conditions, but these vehicles looked like they'd just been washed and polished. The snow around them was undisturbed, as if they'd been sitting in the same spots for years. I walked back to the cafe and found Bill wiping down the counter. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Those trucks in the parking lot, how long have they been here?" Bill looked up from his cleaning. "Which trucks?" "All of them. They all have 1987 license plates, but they look brand new, and none of them have snow on them from the storm." Bill's expression became carefully neutral. "I don't really keep track of who comes and goes. Drivers park where they want, leave when they're ready. But 1987 plates? How is that possible?" Bill set down his cleaning rag and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. "Son, what year do you think it is?" The question caught me off guard. 2024. February 21st, 2024. Bill shook his head slowly. "No, son. It's February 21st, 1987. Has been all day." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline or the indication that he was joking. But his expression was completely serious, and around the cafe the other drivers were nodding in agreement. "That's impossible," I said. "I've got a satellite communicator in my truck that's connected to GPS satellites that weren't even launched until the 1990s. I've got a cell phone, a GPS navigation system. None of that technology existed in 1987. "Technology changes," said one of the drivers, a tall man with a gray beard who'd been sitting silently at a corner booth. "But some things stay the same. The ice roads, the storms, the cold. Time moves different out here than it does in the cities." I looked around the cafe, trying to find some indication that this was all an elaborate joke or some kind of misunderstanding. But everyone was looking at me with expressions of patient sympathy, like they were dealing with someone who was confused or possibly suffering from hypothermia-induced delirium. "Look," I said, pulling out my cell phone. "This is a smartphone. It has internet access, digital cameras, GPS navigation. None of this existed in 1987. The phone's screen was blank. Dead. Not just out of battery. Completely unresponsive, as if it had never worked at all. I tried the power button, tried connecting the charger, tried everything I could think of. Nothing. "Electronics don't work right out here," Bill said gently. "Too cold. Too much interference from the aurora borealis. Most drivers learn to rely on older, simpler equipment." I ran back to my truck and tried the satellite communicator. Dead. The GPS navigation system showed a blank screen. Even the digital dashboard displays that showed engine diagnostics and fuel levels were dark. The only electronics that seemed to be working were the most basic systems: headlights, engine controls, heating system. But that was impossible. I'd been using the GPS and satellite equipment just hours earlier. I'd sent messages to my dispatcher, received weather updates, navigated by electronic instruments for thousands of miles. Modern trucks are controlled by computer systems that simply cannot function without electronic components. Yet somehow, my truck was running perfectly well without any of the digital systems that should have been essential to its operation. I spent the next several hours trying to understand what was happening. I checked and rechecked every electronic system in the truck, looked for loose connections or signs of electrical failure. Everything appeared to be physically intact, but none of the modern equipment would respond to any input. Meanwhile, the other drivers went about their business as if nothing unusual was happening. They fueled their trucks from pumps that looked like they belonged in a museum, used CB radios that seemed to be the most advanced communication technology available, and consulted paper maps and compass readings for navigation. By afternoon, I was forced to accept that I had two choices: stay at the truck stop indefinitely while trying to figure out what was wrong with my equipment, or attempt to complete my delivery using the same methods ice road truckers had used in 1987. I chose to keep moving. Using a paper map that Bill provided, it showed the ice road routes as they existed in 1987. I plotted a course toward the coordinates where Gold Creek Station should be located. The route was longer than the GPS had indicated, following older ice roads that took a more circuitous path through the wilderness. But it was marked and maintained, with mile markers and emergency shelters along the way. "You be careful out there," Bill warned as I prepared to leave. Ice road trucking was dangerous enough back in the day before all the modern safety equipment. You're going back to the old ways now. I asked him what he meant by back in the day, since according to him it was still 1987. But Bill just smiled and said that time was a funny thing in Alaska, especially during the winter months when the sun barely rises and the cold can play tricks on a man's mind. The drive to Gold Creek Station was unlike anything I'd experienced in 26 years of ice road trucking. Without GPS navigation, I had to rely on compass headings and landmark recognition, following a route marked by reflective posts and mile markers that looked like they'd been installed decades earlier. Without satellite communication, I was completely cut off from the outside world, dependent on CB radio for any contact with other drivers. But the strangest thing was how familiar it all felt. Despite using navigation methods I'd never trained on and equipment I'd never operated, I seemed to know instinctively how to read the ice conditions, how to interpret the weather signs, how to maintain safe speeds on surfaces that could give way without warning. It was as if some part of my mind had access to knowledge and experience that belonged to a different era. The ice road itself was rougher than modern routes, with less sophisticated maintenance and fewer safety features. But it was also somehow more authentic, more connected to the natural rhythms of the Arctic environment. Instead of fighting against the wilderness, I felt like I was working with it, reading the signs and adapting to conditions in ways that modern technology had taught me to ignore. I reached Gold Creek Station just before sunset, about 6 hours after leaving the truck stop. The facility looked exactly like an active mining operation should look. Equipment yards, worker barracks, processing buildings, all surrounded by the organized chaos of an industrial site in full operation. Bill Henderson was waiting for me, just as my dispatcher had promised. He was a man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years working in harsh conditions. He had a crew ready to unload the equipment, and he seemed genuinely grateful for the delivery. "We've been waiting for this shipment for 2 weeks," he said as his workers began transferring the cargo from my trailer to their storage facility. "Equipment breakdowns, supply chain problems, weather delays. It's been one thing after another this season." I asked him about the date, about what year he thought it was. He looked at me strangely. 1987, of course. February 21st. Why? I showed him my logbook, which clearly showed 2024 dates and modern trucking regulations. He examined it carefully, then handed it back with a puzzled expression. "That's some fancy logbook you've got there," he said. "Never seen anything like it. But the date's wrong. Must be a printing error." I spent the night at Gold Creek Station, sleeping in their driver's quarters and sharing meals with the mining crew. Everyone was friendly and professional, but they all insisted that it was 1987, that Ronald Reagan was president, that the Cold War was still ongoing. They spoke knowledgeably about current events that had happened 37 years ago, discussed technology and popular culture that had been obsolete for decades. But they also knew things about ice road trucking that seemed impossibly advanced for 1987. Safety procedures that hadn't been developed until the 1990s. Equipment modifications that required materials that didn't exist in the 1980s. Navigation techniques that depended on satellite technology that was still experimental in 1987. The next morning, I started the return trip to Fairbanks, following the same route I'd used to reach the mining station. The drive was uneventful, though I continued to rely on compass navigation and paper maps rather than the electronic systems that remained stubbornly inactive. I reached the Mile 67 truck stop around noon, planning to fuel up and grab lunch before continuing toward civilization. But when I arrived at the location where the facility should have been, there was nothing there. No building, no fuel pumps, no other trucks. Just wilderness, the same endless expanse of snow-covered forest that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. According to my compass and mile markers, I was in exactly the right location, but the truck stop had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. I stopped the truck and climbed out, walking around the area where I was certain the building had been located. The snow was undisturbed, showing no signs that any structure had ever been built there. No foundation marks, no cleared area, no debris or evidence of human activity. Just pristine wilderness that looked like it had been untouched for centuries. I checked my compass readings, verified my position against the mile markers I'd been following, consulted the paper map Bill had given me. Everything indicated that this was the correct location, but there was absolutely nothing to show that a truck stop had ever existed here. The rational part of my mind tried to find logical explanations. Maybe I'd gotten turned around during the drive. Maybe the storm had disoriented me more than I'd realized. Maybe the truck stop was located somewhere else entirely. but I knew I was in the right place. I'd followed the same route in reverse, used the same landmarks, counted the same mile markers. Standing alone in that empty wilderness, I started to understand that something fundamentally impossible was happening to me. I'd spent 2 days at a truck stop that didn't exist, talking to people who insisted it was 1987, using technology that shouldn't have worked, delivering cargo to a mining operation that, according to my 2024 information, had been closed for decades. I climbed back into the truck and continued toward Fairbanks, my mind racing as I tried to process what I'd experienced. The electronic systems that had failed at the truck stop gradually came back to life as I got closer to civilization. First, the GPS navigation system flickered on, showing my current location and the route back to the city. Then the satellite communicator connected, downloading dozens of messages from my dispatcher asking about my status and the status of the delivery. The cell phone took longer to reactivate, but by the time I reached the outskirts of Fairbanks, it was functioning normally again. I had missed calls, text messages, and voicemails spanning the 5 days I'd been missing. According to the timestamps, I'd been gone for exactly the amount of time I remembered, but the content of the messages told a different story. Charlie Marsh from Polar Express had been increasingly frantic about my disappearance. The first messages were routine check-ins, asking for delivery confirmations and estimated return times. But by the 3rd day, the tone had changed to genuine concern for my safety. By the 5th day, search and rescue operations had been initiated, and my next of kin had been notified that I was missing and presumed dead. I called Charlie as soon as I had a reliable signal. "Frank, Jesus Christ, where the hell have you been? We've had the state troopers, Civil Air Patrol, Coast Guard, everybody looking for you. Your truck's GPS went dark 5 days ago somewhere near the Gold Creek route, and we haven't heard a word since." I told him I'd been stranded by the storm, that I'd found shelter at a truck stop and had made the delivery as scheduled. But when he asked for details about the delivery confirmation, I realized I had a problem. "Did Henderson sign off on the delivery?" Charlie asked. "We need documentation for billing and insurance purposes." I checked the paperwork Bill Henderson had given me after unloading the equipment. The forms looked official enough, with the Gold Creek Station letterhead and Henderson's signature, but the dates were all from 1987. Worse, the forms themselves looked like they were from a different era. The paper was yellowed with age, the typefaces were from old-style typewriters, and the language used outdated terminology that hadn't been standard in the trucking industry for decades. "Frank, are you feeling okay?" Charlie asked when I hesitated. "You sound confused. Maybe you should go to a hospital, get checked out for hypothermia or carbon monoxide exposure." I told him I felt fine, that I just needed to get some rest and file my trip report. But privately, I was beginning to wonder if he was right about needing medical attention. Maybe the stress of being stranded in a blizzard had caused some kind of psychological breakdown. Maybe I'd hallucinated the entire experience with the truck stop and the mining operation. But when I got back to the Polar Express yard and unloaded my trailer, there was proof that the delivery had actually happened. The trailer was empty, exactly as it should have been after unloading 40,000 pounds of mining equipment. The load securement straps were coiled and stored exactly where I remembered Bill Henderson's crew putting them. The paperwork, despite its anachronistic appearance, contained accurate descriptions of every piece of equipment that had been shipped. More puzzling was the condition of my truck. Despite having driven nearly 400 miles over rough ice roads in extreme weather conditions, Bertha showed no signs of wear or mechanical stress. The odometer reading was exactly what it should have been based on the distance traveled, but the engine oil was clean, the air filter was spotless, and the tires showed no additional wear. It was as if the truck had been transported to Gold Creek Station and back without actually making the journey. I filed my trip report, submitted the delivery paperwork, and tried to return to normal operations. But over the following weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened during those 5 days. I researched the history of Gold Creek Station, trying to find information that would explain the discrepancies I'd observed. What I found was disturbing. According to public records, Gold Creek Station had indeed been an active mining operation, but it had closed permanently in 1994 after the mineral deposits were exhausted. The facility had been dismantled and the site restored to its natural state as required by environmental regulations. There was no current mining activity at that location, no active permits, no personnel assigned to the site. Bill Henderson was a real person, but he died in 1995 from complications related to lung disease contracted during his years of mining work. His obituary described him as a veteran foreman who had worked at Gold Creek Station during its final years of operation. The Mile 67 truck stop was more difficult to research, partly because the records from that era were incomplete, and partly because truck stops in remote areas often operated informally without extensive documentation. But what little information I could find suggested that such a facility had existed at one time, serving ice road truckers during the late 1980s. It had apparently closed around 1990 when changes in traffic patterns and improved road maintenance made it less necessary. Most disturbing of all was a newspaper article I found from March 1987 describing a search and rescue operation for several ice road truckers who had gone missing during a severe storm in the same area where I'd been stranded. The article mentioned that 12 drivers and their trucks had disappeared without a trace, presumed victims of the harsh weather conditions. The missing drivers included men named Peterson, Anderson, and Kowalski, names I remembered from the truck stop's guest register. I tried to dismiss these findings as coincidences or misunderstandings. Maybe there were other mining operations in the area that I'd confused with Gold Creek Station. Maybe the Bill Henderson I'd met was a different person with the same name. Maybe the research I'd done was incomplete or inaccurate, but I couldn't explain away the delivery receipts. 2 weeks after my return, Charlie Marsh called me into his office with a puzzled expression on his face.
"Frank, I need to ask you something about that Gold Creek delivery. The client is questioning our invoice." "What kind of questions?" "They're saying they never ordered the equipment you delivered. According to their records, Gold Creek Station has been closed for almost 30 years. They have no current operations at that site, no personnel stationed there, no need for mining equipment." I showed him the delivery receipts Bill Henderson had signed, but Charlie just stared at them with growing confusion. "Frank, these receipts are dated 1987. The paper looks like it's decades old. And this signature, we ran it through our verification system, and it matches a Bill Henderson who worked for the mining company, but he died in 1995. Charlie arranged for me to meet with a company psychiatrist, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in treating workers who'd experienced traumatic stress in extreme environments. I told her everything that had happened, from the storm to the truck stop, to the mining station, to the missing electronics. Dr. Chen listened carefully, taking notes and asking occasional questions about specific details. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes. "Frank," she said finally, "what you're describing sounds like a combination of temporal displacement and survival-related hallucinations. The human mind has remarkable mechanisms for dealing with life-threatening situations, and sometimes those mechanisms can create experiences that feel completely real but don't match objective reality." "So, you think I imagined the whole thing?" "I think you experienced something that helped you survive 5 days alone in a blizzard. Whether that experience corresponds to external reality is less important than the fact that it kept you alive and allowed you to complete your mission." But Dr. Chen couldn't explain the empty trailer, the delivery receipts, or the fact that my truck showed no signs of the journey I remembered taking. She suggested that I might have experienced a dissociative episode brought on by extreme stress, during which I had completed the delivery and return trip while in an altered state of consciousness. Memory is unreliable under the best of circumstances, she explained. At extreme cold, isolation, sleep deprivation, and the stress of a life-threatening situation, and it's entirely possible for the mind to construct false memories that feel more real than actual events. I wanted to believe her explanation. It was rational, scientific, and didn't require me to accept that impossible things could happen in the Alaska wilderness. But there were too many details that didn't fit the psychological model she was proposing. 3 months later, I was assigned to another ice road run, this time to a different mining operation in the same general area. I tried to convince Charlie to give the job to another driver, but we were short-staffed and I was the most experienced ice road operator available. The route took me past the location where I'd encountered the Mile 67 truck stop. I wasn't planning to stop. There was nothing there but wilderness, but as I approached the area, I saw something that made me pull over. Tire tracks in the snow. Fresh ones, leading from the main ice road toward the forest. Multiple sets, from different trucks, all heading toward the same invisible destination. I followed the tracks for about a quarter mile until they reached a clearing in the trees. There was nothing visible there, just snow and forest. But the tracks continued in organized patterns, as if a dozen trucks were parked in an invisible parking lot. I climbed out of my cab and walked around the clearing, following the tire tracks with my eyes. They formed a clear pattern, vehicles parked in neat rows, with spaces left for maneuvering and access. At the center of the clearing, where the main building should have been, the snow was compressed in a rectangular pattern that suggested heavy foot traffic. As I stood there, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of diesel engines idling, muffled and distant but unmistakably real. CB radio chatter, too faint to understand but clearly human voices. The clink of silverware against plates, the hiss of air brakes, all the ambient sounds of an active truck stop. But there was nothing to see, just empty wilderness and the tracks of invisible vehicles. I got back in my truck and drove away as fast as ice road conditions would allow. But in my mirrors, I could see smoke rising from the clearing, as if someone had just started a fire in the invisible building's chimney. The second delivery went smoothly, with no complications or unusual experiences. The mining operation was modern and well documented. The personnel were clearly living in 2024, and all of my electronic equipment functioned normally throughout the trip. It was exactly the kind of routine ice road run I'd been making for 26 years. But on the return trip, I made a detour. I drove back to the Gold Creek Station coordinates, following current GPS navigation to the exact location where I'd made my delivery 3 months earlier. What I found was a historical marker placed by the State Tourism Department, commemorating the site of the former mining operation. According to the marker, Gold Creek Station had been one of Alaska's most productive placer mining operations from 1975 to 1994. At its peak, it had employed over 100 workers and produced significant quantities of gold and other precious metals. The operation had closed when the easily accessible deposits were exhausted, and the site had been restored to its natural state in accordance with environmental regulations. The marker also mentioned that 12 ice road truckers had died in the area during a severe storm in February 1987, making it one of Alaska's worst trucking disasters. Their bodies and vehicles had never been recovered, despite extensive search and rescue operations. A memorial plaque listed their names, including several that I recognized from the truck stop guest register. I walked around the site, looking for any evidence of the active mining operation I'd encountered 3 months earlier. There was nothing. No buildings, no equipment, no signs of recent human activity. The forest was returning to claim the area, with young trees growing up through what might once have been cleared land. But as I prepared to leave, I noticed something carved into the bark of a large spruce tree near the historical marker. It was fresh, cut deep enough to expose the pale wood beneath the bark. F. Kowalski, FEB 21, 2024. Thank you for the ride. The carving was in handwriting I recognized, though I couldn't immediately place where I'd seen it before. Then I remembered. It matched the signature on the delivery receipts Bill Henderson had given me at Gold Creek Station. I drove back to Fairbanks in a state of confused wonderment, no longer certain about the nature of reality or my place in it. The experience had shaken my fundamental assumptions about how the world works, about the relationship between past and present, about the boundaries between the living and the dead. Over the following months, I began researching other reports of temporal anomalies in Alaska, particularly those associated with extreme weather and isolation. What I found was a pattern of similar experiences dating back decades. Stories of travelers who encountered people and places that shouldn't have existed, who completed journeys through impossible conditions, who brought back evidence of experiences that couldn't be verified. Most of these reports had been dismissed as hallucinations, folklore, or the products of psychological stress. But taken together, they suggested something more complex and mysterious than simple misperception or mental breakdown. I started keeping detailed records of my own experiences and those of other drivers who were willing to share their stories. Over time, I collected accounts from dozens of ice road truckers, bush pilots, wilderness guides, and other people who worked in Alaska's most remote and dangerous areas. The stories varied in their details, but they shared common elements. Extreme weather conditions, usually involving blizzards or whiteout conditions. Encounters with people or places that seemed normal at first, but gradually revealed anachronistic or impossible characteristics. Electronic equipment failures during the experiences, followed by normal function afterward. Physical evidence that confirmed the experiences had actually happened, despite their apparent impossibility. Dr. Chen, the company psychiatrist, remained skeptical of my research. She suggested that I was exhibiting symptoms of post-traumatic stress and recommended that I consider retiring from ice road trucking to pursue less dangerous work. The human mind is remarkably good at creating meaningful patterns from random events, she told me during one of our sessions. What you're interpreting as evidence of supernatural phenomena could simply be the result of coincidence, misperception, and the tendency to remember unusual events more clearly than routine ones. But Dr. Chen couldn't explain why so many independent witnesses reported similar experiences, or why the physical evidence consistently supported the impossible stories they told. She couldn't explain the carving in the tree, the delivery receipts with signatures from dead men, or the tire tracks in the snow that led to invisible destinations. Eventually, I decided that the truth was less important than the meaning. Whatever had happened to me during those 5 days in February 2024, it had taught me something profound about the nature of time, memory, and human connection. I had experienced a kind of fellowship with drivers who had died decades before I was born, had shared meals and conversations with men whose stories would otherwise have been lost to history. In some way that I couldn't fully understand, I had been given the opportunity to honor their memory and complete their unfinished journeys. The fact that this had required me to step outside the normal flow of time seemed less significant than the fact that it had happened at all. I continued working as an ice road trucker for 2 more seasons before finally retiring in 2026. During that time, I had several more unusual experiences, though none as dramatic or sustained as the Mile 67 truck stop incident. I learned to recognize the signs that preceded these temporal anomalies. Certain weather patterns, specific atmospheric conditions, particular combinations of isolation and stress that seemed to thin the barriers between past and present. I also learned that I wasn't alone in experiencing these phenomena. There was an informal network of Alaska workers who shared similar stories, who had learned to navigate the strange borderlands where the normal rules of reality became negotiable. We didn't advertise our experiences or try to convince skeptics of their validity. We simply helped each other understand and cope with encounters that defied rational explanation.
The Mile 67 truck stop appears to still be operating, though only during severe weather conditions and only for drivers who need it most desperately. I've encountered several truckers over the years who mentioned stopping there during emergency situations, always describing it as a life-saving refuge that appeared just when they thought they were going to freeze to death in their cabs. They describe the same dated decor, the same quiet atmosphere, the same insistence by the staff that it's still 1987. Some drivers accept the anachronism without question, grateful for shelter and warmth. Others, like me, are disturbed by the implications and spend months afterward trying to understand what they experienced. But all of them describe Bill, the counterman who serves coffee and maintains the impossible fiction that Ronald Reagan is still president, that the Cold War is still ongoing, that the 12 missing truckers from 1987 are still making their deliveries and still gathering each night to share stories and plan their routes. I think Bill and his customers are trapped in a kind of temporal loop, doomed to repeat the same conversations and experiences until some cosmic condition is met that will allow them to move on to whatever comes next. Or perhaps they've chosen to remain in that moment because it represents something important to them, a time when their work mattered, when they were part of a community, when the dangers they faced had meaning and purpose. I don't know if I helped them by participating in their eternal truck stop conversation, or if they helped me by providing shelter during a life-threatening storm. Maybe the truth is that we helped each other, that the boundaries between past and present became permeable long enough to allow different generations of ice road truckers to share knowledge, experience, and fellowship across the decades. What I do know is that I'm grateful for the experience, despite its impossibility and the questions it raised about the nature of reality. I was privileged to meet men who had died before I was born, to learn from their experience, to carry their stories back to the world of the living. And I know that somewhere in the Alaska wilderness, in a place that exists only during the worst storms and the darkest nights, Bill is still pouring coffee for stranded drivers, still insisting that it's 1987, still maintaining the fiction that allows a dozen dead truckers to continue their eternal routes through the landscape of memory and loss. The Mile 67 truck stop is still there, waiting for the next driver who needs shelter more than he needs explanations, who values warmth and human companionship more than he values rational understanding of how the world is supposed to work. And if you're ever driving the ice roads during a blizzard, when your electronics have failed and your fuel is running low and the cold is starting to seep through your cab insulation, watch for the yellow lights in the distance and the sign that reads, Mile 67 Truck Stop. Pull in, order coffee and a meal, pay the 1987 prices, and don't ask too many questions about why the calendar on the wall is 37 years out of date. Just be grateful for the shelter, the warmth, and the company of men who understand what it means to drive the loneliest roads in America during the darkest months of the year. And when morning comes and the storm clears and you find yourself back on an empty stretch of wilderness highway, remember that some things are more important than being able to explain how they're possible. Because in the end, we're all just trying to complete our deliveries and make it home safely, whether we're driving in 1987 or 2024 or some impossible moment that exists between the two. And sometimes the only thing that matters is knowing that someone will be there to help us when we need it most, even if that someone happens to be a ghost. My name is Dale Peterson, and I've been driving freight trucks in Alaska for 18 years. Not as long as some of the old-timers, but long enough to know the difference between a routine delivery and something that'll keep you awake at night for the rest of your life. I'm 41 years old, divorced, no kids, and I work for Arctic Supply Lines out of Anchorage. We handle deliveries to some of the most remote businesses, research stations, and government facilities in the state. Places where regular delivery services won't go, where the roads are more like suggestions than actual routes, where a wrong turn can put you in wilderness so vast you might never find your way back. I didn't start out wanting to be a trucker. Back in 2006, I was working construction in Anchorage, making decent money building houses and commercial buildings during the brief Alaska construction season. But the housing market crash hit Alaska hard, and by 2007, most of the construction companies were laying off workers or going out of business entirely. I needed work that would keep me employed year-round, and trucking seemed like a stable option. Arctic Supply Lines was hiring drivers willing to handle the difficult routes, the remote deliveries that required special permits, survival training, and equipment that could handle extreme conditions. The pay was good, better than construction when you factored in the overtime and hazard pay. Most importantly, it was steady work that didn't depend on seasonal weather or economic fluctuations. I started with short-haul deliveries around Anchorage and the Kenai Peninsula, learning the basics of commercial driving and getting familiar with Alaska's unique challenges. Bad weather that could change from clear skies to whiteout conditions in minutes. Roads that were more like trails, often unmarked and sometimes impassable. Wildlife that would step into traffic without warning. Moose, bears, caribou, all of them big enough to total a truck and kill the driver. After a couple years of proving myself on the easier routes, the company started giving me the specialty deliveries. Scientific equipment to research stations, supplies to remote government facilities, emergency shipments to mining operations and oil field installations. These were the runs that paid the big money, but they also required skills and equipment that most drivers didn't have. My truck is a 2017 Freightliner Cascadia, modified for extreme weather operations with auxiliary heating systems, extended range fuel capacity, and survival equipment that could keep me alive for a week if I got stranded. I call her Big Betty, though she's not particularly big by Alaska trucking standards. What she lacks in size, she makes up for in reliability and cold weather performance. The cargo area is specially configured for sensitive deliveries. Climate-controlled compartments for scientific equipment, secure storage for valuable or dangerous materials, and tracking systems that monitor temperature, humidity, and location throughout the journey. When you're delivering $100,000 worth of research equipment to a station that's only accessible 3 months out of the year, you can't afford to have anything go wrong. I've made deliveries to places most people have never heard of and would never want to visit. Research stations studying climate change in the Arctic Ocean. Seismic monitoring facilities that track earthquake activity along the fault lines. Military installations that officially don't exist but need regular supplies of food, fuel, and equipment. Each delivery comes with specific instructions, security protocols, and contact information for the people who are supposed to receive the shipment. Most of the time, these deliveries are routine despite the challenging conditions. You follow the GPS coordinates, navigate the terrible roads, make contact with the facility personnel, and complete the delivery according to the manifest. The people at these remote locations are always grateful to see you. You represent their lifeline to the outside world, bringing not just supplies but news, mail, and human contact. But every once in a while, you get a delivery that doesn't make sense. Coordinates that lead to empty wilderness. Contact numbers that don't work. Facilities that should be there according to your paperwork but can't be found no matter how carefully you search. When that happens, you document everything, take photos, and report back to dispatch. Usually it turns out to be a mistake in the shipping manifest or outdated information about a facility that's been closed or relocated. What happened to me on November 7th, 2023 was different from anything I'd encountered before. It was the kind of delivery that started out routine and gradually became impossible. The kind of experience that makes you question your own sanity and wonder if there are things happening in the Alaska wilderness that don't follow any rules you understand. The call came from dispatch around 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Carol Jensen, who handles the specialty deliveries for Arctic Supply Lines, had an urgent shipment that needed to get to a facility called Northern Research Station Alpha. The cargo was laboratory equipment and supplies valued at over $200,000, and the customer was paying premium rates for expedited delivery. "It's a government contract," Carol explained when I picked up the phone. "Department of Energy Research Facility about 240 miles northeast of Anchorage. They've been waiting for this equipment for 6 weeks, and they need it operational before the winter weather makes travel impossible." I asked about the route and the delivery specifics. Northern Research Station Alpha was located in a remote area near the Copper River, accessible by a combination of state highways and unmarked access roads. The facility studied renewable energy applications in extreme climates, testing solar panels, wind generators, and battery systems under the harsh conditions of the Alaska interior. "The contact person is Dr. Sarah Mitchell," Carol said, reading from her computer screen. "She's the station director, been there for about 3 years. The facility operates year-round with a staff of about 12 researchers and support personnel. The delivery address was GPS coordinates rather than a street address, which was normal for remote facilities. The coordinates placed the station about 40 miles off the nearest maintained road, accessed by what the manifest described as seasonal access road. 4 D required, weather-dependent conditions. I loaded the equipment at a warehouse in Anchorage around 10 a.m. Everything was properly crated and labeled, with detailed handling instructions and environmental requirements clearly marked on each container. The total weight was about 15,000 pounds, well within my truck's capacity, but valuable enough that I double-checked the load securement and climate control systems. The first part of the drive was straightforward. Highway 1 north out of Anchorage, then Highway 4 toward Glen Allen, following routes I'd driven dozens of times over the years. The weather was cooperating. Clear skies, temperature around 25 degrees, light winds. Perfect conditions for a long-haul delivery to a remote location. I stopped for fuel and lunch in Glen Allen around 2 p.m., making good time despite the heavy load. The truck stop was busy with other drivers making deliveries to oil field installations and mining operations, the usual mix of local drivers and long-haul operators working the Alaska routes. While I was refueling, I ran into another Arctic Supply Lines driver, a guy named Tom Bradley, who I'd worked with off and on for about 5 years. Tom was heading back to Anchorage after making a delivery to a mining operation near Valdez. "You know anything about Northern Research Station Alpha?" I asked him while we waited for our fuel tanks to fill. Tom frowned. "Never heard of it. What kind of facility?" "Department of Energy Research Station. Solar panels and wind generators, stuff like that. Supposed to be about 40 miles off the highway near the Copper River." "Doesn't ring a bell," Tom said. "But there's a lot of government facilities out there that keep low profiles. Defense Department, Energy Department, Fish and Wildlife Service. Half the time they don't want people to know they exist." I checked my paperwork again, confirmed the GPS coordinates and the contact information. Everything looked legitimate. Official Department of Energy letterhead, proper authorization codes, valid purchase order numbers. If it was some kind of mistake or fraud, it was a very sophisticated one. The turnoff from Highway 4 was marked only by a small metal sign that read, "Authorized personnel only," and a Forest Service road number that matched my delivery instructions. The access road was unpaved but well-maintained, with recent grading marks and reflective markers every quarter mile. It looked like the kind of road that government agencies build to access remote facilities, functional rather than scenic, designed to handle heavy equipment and supply vehicles. For the first 20 miles, the road was in good condition despite the remote location. It wound through dense forest of spruce and birch, following natural contours of the landscape and avoiding steep grades that would be difficult for loaded trucks. I passed several other Forest Service roads branching off to the left and right, all of them marked with numbers and "No Public Access" signs. Around 4:30 p.m., I reached what appeared to be a security checkpoint, a small building beside the road with official-looking signs about restricted access and the requirement to check in with facility personnel. but the building was unmanned, and the barrier gate was standing open. A sign directed visitors to proceed to the main facility and report to the administrative office. I continued down the access road, which became rougher and more narrow as it penetrated deeper into the wilderness. The forest was thick enough to block most of the afternoon sunlight, creating an environment of perpetual twilight that made navigation more difficult. My GPS showed that I was still on course, but the estimated arrival time kept changing as the road conditions forced me to reduce speed. Around 5:15 p.m., just as the sun was setting, I reached the GPS coordinates for Northern Research Station Alpha. What I found there didn't match any description of an active research facility. The road ended in a large clearing that had obviously been developed for industrial use. I could see the remains of several concrete foundations, electrical infrastructure, and what might have been access roads to different areas of the facility. But everything was abandoned, had been for years by the look of it. The buildings were gone, leaving only concrete pads and the rusted remains of mechanical systems. Weeds and small trees were growing up through cracks in the concrete, and the electrical lines had been cut and removed. It looked like a facility that had been deliberately dismantled and abandoned, with only the most permanent infrastructure left behind. I parked Big Betty in what had probably been the main parking area and climbed out to look around. The silence was absolute except for the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of abandoned metal structures. No lights, no vehicles, no sign of recent human activity. I walked around the site, trying to understand what I was seeing. The concrete foundations were substantial, suggesting buildings that had been designed for long-term use. The electrical infrastructure included transformers and junction boxes that indicated significant power requirements. This had definitely been a major facility at one time, but it had been closed and dismantled with obvious care and thoroughness. Near what might have been the main administrative building, I found a metal plaque mounted on a concrete post. The text was partially obscured by corrosion and weather damage, but I could make out enough to understand what it said. Northern Research Station, Alpha, U.S. Department of Energy, Renewable Energy Research Facility, established 1998, decommissioned 2009. The plaque included a warning about hazardous materials and instructions to contact the Department of Energy if any dangerous substances were discovered on the site. But there was no indication of what had happened to the facility or why it had been closed. I pulled out my cell phone to call dispatch, but I had no signal. That wasn't unusual in remote areas of Alaska, but it meant I couldn't get immediate guidance about what to do with a delivery to a facility that had been closed for 14 years. I tried the satellite communicator that I carried for emergency situations. After several attempts, I managed to connect to the Arctic Supply Line's dispatch center and explained the situation to Carol Jensen. "That's impossible," Carol said when I described what I'd found. "I just talked to Dr. Mitchell yesterday to confirm the delivery details. She said they were waiting for the equipment and had crews standing by to install it immediately upon arrival." I told Carol about the plaque and the obvious abandonment of the facility. There was a long pause before she responded. "Dale, I need you to double-check the GPS coordinates. Make sure you're in the right location." I confirmed the coordinates, checked them against my paperwork, and described the access road and security checkpoint I'd passed. Everything matched the delivery instructions exactly. "This doesn't make sense," Carol said. "Let me make some phone calls and see what I can find out. In the meantime, secure the cargo and see if you can find any current contact information at the site." I spent the next hour searching the abandoned facility for any clues about what had happened or where the current research station might be located. I found several more plaques and signs, all confirming that this was indeed Northern Research Station Alpha, but all indicating that it had been decommissioned in 2009. Near the remains of what might have been a laboratory building, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. A delivery receipt, partially buried under fallen leaves but still legible, dated just 2 weeks earlier. It was from Arctic Supply Lines, signed by someone named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, acknowledging receipt of scientific equipment and supplies. The signature matched the one on my current delivery manifest. I stared at that receipt for a long time, trying to understand how it was possible. The facility had been abandoned for 14 years, but someone had signed for a delivery 2 weeks ago using the same name and signature that was on my paperwork. Either there was another Northern Research Station Alpha that I hadn't found, or something very strange was happening. I tried the satellite communicator again, but I couldn't get a signal. The sun had set completely, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I needed to make a decision about whether to spend the night in the truck or attempt to drive back to the highway in the dark. That's when I saw the lights. They were faint at first, just a distant glow through the trees that might have been moonlight reflecting off snow. But as I watched, they became brighter and more defined. Electric lights, definitely artificial, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and followed what remained of an access road toward the light source. After about a quarter-mile walk through increasingly dense forest, I emerged into another clearing where I found an active research facility. It was exactly what I'd expected based on the delivery manifest. A collection of modern buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with solar panel arrays, wind generators, and other renewable energy equipment visible in the perimeter lighting. Vehicles were parked near the main building, and lights were on in several windows. Smoke was rising from what appeared to be a heating system chimney. A sign near the entrance read, "Northern Research Station Alpha, Department of Energy Research Facility. Authorized personnel only." It looked new, recently installed with no signs of weather damage or aging. I walked back to get my truck, driving carefully down the narrow access road to the active facility. As I parked near the main building, several people came out to meet me, all wearing heavy winter clothing and official-looking ID badges. "You must be Dale from Arctic Supply Lines," said a woman who appeared to be in her early 40s. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, station director. We've been waiting for this equipment." I showed her the delivery manifest and began unloading the cargo according to her instructions. Dr. Mitchell had a crew of technicians ready to move the equipment into the laboratory buildings, and everything proceeded exactly as it should have during a normal delivery to a remote facility. "Sorry about the confusion with the access road," Dr. Mitchell said as we completed the paperwork. "We're in the process of updating our GPS coordinates with the shipping companies. The old facility was closed years ago when we moved to this location." I asked her about the abandoned buildings I'd found at the original coordinates. Dr. Mitchell nodded knowingly. "That was the prototype station, established in the late 1990s as a proof of concept for renewable energy research in extreme climates. When the program expanded, we built this new facility with better infrastructure and more advanced equipment. The old site was decommissioned in 2009. That explained the plaque and the abandoned infrastructure, but it didn't explain why my delivery instructions had led me to the old facility instead of the new one. I mentioned this to Dr. Mitchell, who seemed genuinely surprised. "That's odd. All of our shipping instructions should reflect the current facility coordinates. We updated all the databases when we moved operations 5 years ago." She asked to see my delivery manifest, studying it carefully under the overhead lights. After a few minutes, she looked up with a puzzled expression. "These are definitely our current coordinates," she said, pointing to the GPS numbers on the paperwork. "But you said they led you to the old facility?" I showed her the route I'd taken on my GPS device, tracing the path from the highway to the abandoned site. Dr. Mitchell compared it to the coordinates on the manifest, and they were identical. "This is very strange," she said. "These coordinates should have brought you directly here. There must be some kind of error in your GPS system." But I knew there wasn't an error. I double-checked the coordinates multiple times, and my GPS had led me exactly where the numbers indicated. Somehow, the same coordinates had taken me to 2 different locations, first to an abandoned facility, then to an active research station that was supposed to be in the same place. Dr. Mitchell signed the delivery receipt and thanked me for bringing the equipment despite the navigation difficulties. Her signature was identical to the one I'd found on the 2-week-old receipt at the abandoned site. I drove back toward the highway through the darkness, my mind racing as I tried to understand what had happened. The access road from the active facility joined the main Forest Service road about 5 miles from where I'd originally entered, suggesting that the two locations were in completely different areas despite having identical GPS coordinates. When I reached the highway, I stopped to call dispatch using my cell phone. Carol Jensen answered on the first ring.
Dale, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. I did some research on Northern Research Station Alpha, and there's something you need to know. What did you find? The facility was closed in 2009, just like you said. But Dale, according to the Department of Energy, it was never reopened. There is no current research station at that location. I told Carol about finding the active facility and completing the delivery to Dr. Mitchell. There was a long silence before she responded. Dale, that's impossible. I called the Department of Energy directly. Northern Research Station Alpha was permanently decommissioned in 2009 after a budget reduction eliminated the renewable energy research program. The site is maintained as surplus property, but there's no active research being conducted there. Then who did I deliver the equipment to? I don't know, but I'm starting to think there's been some kind of fraud or mistake. Can you describe the people you met at the facility? I described Dr. Mitchell and her research team, the modern buildings and equipment, the professional manner in which they'd handled the delivery. Everything had seemed completely legitimate, exactly what you'd expect from a government research facility. Dale, I need you to go back there tomorrow morning. Take photos of everything, the buildings, the people, the equipment. If there's really an active facility operating at that location, we need to document it and figure out why it's not in the official records. I spent the night at a motel in Glenallen, unable to sleep as I tried to process what had happened. The logical explanation was that I'd made some kind of mistake. Wrong coordinates, misidentified facility, confusion about locations. But I'd been making deliveries to remote sites for 18 years, and I'd never experienced anything like this before. The next morning, I drove back to the Forest Service road that led to Northern Research Station Alpha. In daylight, I could see details that had been hidden in the darkness. The access road was well maintained with recent grading and new signage at regular intervals. Everything suggested an active facility with regular traffic and maintenance. When I reached the GPS coordinates from my delivery manifest, I found the abandoned site exactly as I'd left it the day before. Concrete foundations overgrown with weeds, rusted infrastructure, obvious signs of long-term abandonment. No recent tire tracks, no footprints, no indication that anyone had been there in years. I searched carefully for the access road that had led to the active facility, but I couldn't find it. The forest was unbroken in all directions, with no trails or roads visible through the trees. According to my GPS, the active facility should have been less than a quarter mile away, but there was no path to reach it. I spent 3 hours walking through the forest in every direction, looking for any sign of the buildings, vehicles, or people I'd encountered the night before. I found nothing but wilderness. No cleared areas, no access roads, no evidence that any human activity had ever taken place in the area. Back at the abandoned site, I took dozens of photographs as Carol had requested. The concrete foundations, the rusted equipment, the weathered plaques indicating the facility's closure in 2009. Everything was exactly as I'd documented the day before, with no signs of recent activity or disturbance. But when I looked more carefully at the area where I'd found the delivery receipt, I discovered something that made my hands shake. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, matching the tread pattern of my truck's tires. The tracks led from the parking area to a loading dock that I hadn't noticed before, as if I'd backed up to unload cargo. I followed the tire tracks, examining them carefully. They were definitely from my truck, and they were definitely recent. The tread marks were crisp and clear, without any signs of weather damage. But I had never unloaded cargo at this location. I was certain of that. Near the loading dock,
I found something else that shouldn't have been there. Wooden shipping crates, broken open and empty, with shipping labels from Arctic supply lines. The labels showed yesterday's date and my name as the delivery driver. The crates matched the specifications of the laboratory equipment I'd delivered to Dr. Mitchell's facility. I stood there staring at those empty crates for a long time, trying to understand how they could exist. I had clear memories of unloading the cargo at the active research facility, of watching Dr. Mitchell's team move the equipment into their laboratory buildings, but here was physical evidence that I had also unloaded the same cargo at the abandoned site. I took photos of everything: the tire tracks, the shipping crates, the labels with yesterday's date. Then I loaded the empty crates into my truck and drove back to Anchorage, my mind reeling with questions I couldn't answer.
Carol Jensen was waiting for me when I arrived at the Arctic Supply Line's office. She examined the photos I'd taken and the empty shipping crates, her expression growing more puzzled with each piece of evidence. "Dale, this doesn't make any sense," she said after reviewing everything. "According to our shipping database, the cargo was delivered successfully to Northern Research Station Alpha and signed for by Dr. Sarah Mitchell. We have electronic confirmation of delivery, payment authorization from the Department of Energy, and all the proper documentation." She showed me the computer records, which confirmed everything she'd said. The delivery was listed as completed, with Dr. Mitchell's signature scanned into the system and payment processing normally through government channels. But if the facility has been closed since 2009, who authorized the payment? Who signed for the delivery? Carol had spent the morning making phone calls to various government agencies, trying to get clarification about the status of Northern Research Station Alpha. What she'd learned was disturbing. The Department of Energy has no record of any current research activities at that location, she said. No active personnel assigned to the facility, no budget allocations for operations, no contracts for equipment or supplies. According to their records, the site has been surplus property for 14 years. But someone paid for the delivery. That's what's really strange. The payment authorization came through legitimate Department of Energy channels with proper account numbers and authorization codes. The money has already been deposited into our account. But when I called the DOE accounting department, they have no record of authorizing any payments to our company. We spent the rest of the day trying to trace the source of the payment and the origin of the delivery request. Every lead ended in contradictions and impossibilities. The paperwork was legitimate, but the facility didn't exist. The payment was real, but it hadn't been authorized. The delivery had been completed, but the recipient couldn't be identified. 3 days later, Carol called me with news that made the situation even more confusing. "Dale, I got a call from the Department of Energy Inspector General's office. They're investigating possible fraud related to Northern Research Station Alpha. Apparently, someone has been using the facility's name and codes to order equipment and supplies from multiple vendors." "How long has this been going on?" "That's the weird part. According to their investigation, fraudulent orders have been placed using Northern Research Station Alpha's identity for over 10 years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment, all delivered to that location, all paid for through legitimate government accounts." The Inspector General's office wanted to interview me about my delivery, but when we scheduled the meeting, they called back to cancel it. The investigation had been closed, they said, due to lack of evidence of actual fraud. All the payments had been legitimate, all the deliveries had been completed according to contract specifications, and no government funds had been misappropriated. "They're treating it as an administrative error," Carol explained. "Some kind of computer glitch that created phantom orders and payments. They've corrected the database errors and written off the expenditures as unavoidable losses." But I knew it wasn't a computer glitch. I'd met Dr. Sarah Mitchell, talked to her research team, watched them unload equipment that they obviously needed and knew how to use. The facility I'd delivered to was real, active, and professionally operated.
The fact that it didn't appear in government databases didn't mean it didn't exist. Over the following weeks, I researched everything I could find about Northern Research Station Alpha and its history. What I learned painted a picture of a facility that had been much more important than the official records suggested. The renewable energy research conducted at the original facility had produced several significant breakthroughs in solar panel efficiency and battery storage technology. Patents filed by the research team had become the basis for commercial products that were now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The closure of the facility in 2009 had been controversial, with several researchers claiming that their work was being terminated for political rather than scientific reasons. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a real person, a renewable energy specialist with advanced degrees from MIT and Stanford. She had worked at Northern Research Station Alpha from 2006 until its closure in 2009, and had published numerous papers based on her research there. But according to official records, she had died in a car accident in 2011, 2 years after the facility closed. Yet I had clear memories of meeting her, talking to her, watching her sign the delivery receipt. Either the official records were wrong, or something impossible had happened in that clearing in the Alaska wilderness. 6 months later, I was assigned to another delivery in the same general area. A routine shipment of supplies to a Fish and Wildlife Service research station about 50 miles from the original Northern Research Station Alpha coordinates. I wasn't planning to make any detours, but as I drove past the turnoff to the Forest Service road, I noticed something that made me pull over. There was a new sign at the intersection, an official-looking metal plaque that read, Northern Research Station Alpha, Active Research Facility, Authorized Personnel Only. The sign looked new, recently installed, with no signs of weather damage or aging. I drove down the access road following the same route I'd taken 8 months earlier. When I reached the GPS coordinates, I found the active research facility exactly as I'd left it. Modern buildings, solar panel arrays, wind generators, vehicles parked near the main building. Lights were on in several windows, and I could see people moving around inside. Dr. Sarah Mitchell came out to greet me as I parked near the main building. She looked exactly the same as she had during my previous visit, wearing the same style of winter clothing and official ID badge. "Dale, good to see you again," she said. "We weren't expecting a delivery today, but it's always nice to have visitors." I told her I was just passing through making a delivery to the Fish and Wildlife Station. Dr. Mitchell nodded knowingly. "That's Dr. Yamamoto's operation. Good people, doing important work on climate change impacts on wildlife populations. We collaborate with them occasionally on energy efficiency projects." I asked her about the status of her renewable energy research, curious to see if her answers would be consistent with my previous visit. Dr. Mitchell seemed happy to discuss their work, describing recent advances in cold weather solar panel technology and improvements in battery storage systems. Everything she said was consistent with legitimate scientific research being conducted by qualified professionals. Her knowledge was detailed and current, suggesting years of hands-on experience with the technologies she described. If she was somehow a fraud or an imposter, she was remarkably well-informed about renewable energy research. "How long have you been working at this facility?" I asked. "About 15 years now," Dr. Mitchell said. "I started here in 2008, just before we moved from the old prototype station to this location. It's been the most rewarding work of my career." But according to the official records, Dr. Mitchell had died in 2011, and the facility had been closed since 2009. Either the official records were completely wrong, or I was talking to someone who had been dead for 12 years. I spent about an hour at the facility, touring the laboratories and equipment areas that Dr. Mitchell offered to show me. Everything was modern, well-maintained, and obviously in active use. The research being conducted was legitimate and important, with potential applications that could benefit energy production worldwide. When I left, Dr. Mitchell walked me back to my truck and thanked me for visiting. As I drove away, I watched the facility in my rearview mirror until it disappeared behind the trees. It looked exactly like what it claimed to be, an active government research station conducting valuable scientific work. But when I completed my delivery to the Fish and Wildlife Station and mentioned Northern Research Station Alpha to Dr. Yamamoto, he looked at me with confusion.
"There's no research facility by that name in this area," he said. "The only Department of Energy installation I know of was closed years ago after budget cuts eliminated their renewable energy program." I drove back past the turnoff on my way to the highway, but the sign was gone. There was no indication that an access road existed at that location, no evidence that I'd driven down it just hours earlier. The forest was unbroken, with no gaps in the tree line that might have concealed a road. Over the next 2 years, I made several more deliveries to the area, always taking the opportunity to check the coordinates for Northern Research Station Alpha. Sometimes I found the abandoned site with its overgrown foundations and rusted infrastructure. Sometimes I found the active facility with Dr. Mitchell and her research team. And sometimes I found nothing at all, just wilderness that showed no signs of human activity. There was no pattern to these encounters that I could identify. Weather conditions, time of day, and seasonal factors didn't seem to influence which version of reality I experienced. The same GPS coordinates would lead to different destinations on different visits, as if the location itself was somehow unstable or uncertain. I documented everything carefully, keeping detailed records of each visit and taking photographs whenever possible. But the photos were inconsistent too. Sometimes they showed the active facility clearly. Other times they appeared to be corrupted or overexposed despite being taken with the same camera under similar conditions. Arctic Supply Lines eventually assigned me to different routes, saying that my reports about Northern Research Station Alpha were causing confusion with government customers and creating liability concerns for the company. Carol Jensen was sympathetic but firm about the need to avoid controversy. "Dale, I believe you're reporting what you experienced," she told me during my final meeting about the situation. "But we can't have drivers filing reports about facilities that officially don't exist. It creates problems with our government contracts and our insurance coverage." I understood her position, but I also knew what I had experienced. I had delivered equipment to an active research facility, met with qualified scientists, and observed legitimate research being conducted. The fact that this didn't match official records didn't make it less real. I started researching other drivers who had made deliveries to remote facilities in Alaska, looking for similar experiences. What I found was a pattern of encounters that defied easy explanation. Deliveries to facilities that were supposed to be closed, meetings with personnel who were officially deceased, payments from accounts that didn't exist. Most drivers were reluctant to discuss these experiences, afraid of being labeled as unreliable or mentally unstable. But the few who were willing to share their stories described encounters very similar to mine. Routine deliveries that became impossible, normal procedures that led to abnormal results. Tom Bradley, the Arctic Supply Lines driver I'd met at the fuel stop in Glen Allen, eventually admitted that he'd had his own experience with a facility that shouldn't have existed. He delivered supplies to a Coast Guard station that had been decommissioned in 1995, meeting with personnel who signed for the shipment and processed payment through legitimate government channels. "I don't talk about it much," Tom told me during a quiet conversation at a truck stop outside Anchorage. "People think you're crazy if you say you delivered cargo to a place that's been closed for 30 years. But I know what I experienced, and I know it was real." Other drivers had similar stories. Deliveries to mining operations that had been shut down for decades, meetings with forestmen who had died years earlier, payments from companies that had gone out of business before the drivers were born. All of them involved remote locations in Alaska. All of them included documentation that appeared legitimate, and all of them left the drivers questioning their understanding of reality. I began to think that Alaska itself might be somehow different from other places.
that the extreme conditions and vast distances created environments where normal rules didn't always apply. The isolation, the harsh weather, and the psychological stress of working in such conditions might create situations where past and present became blurred, where facilities that had once existed could somehow continue to operate outside the normal flow of time. Or perhaps there were government operations that continued to function despite official closure, maintained for reasons that weren't reflected in public records. Black budget programs, classified research projects, facilities that were too important to shut down despite bureaucratic decisions to the contrary. But the simplest explanation was also the most disturbing. That I had somehow become unstuck from normal reality, doomed to make deliveries to places that existed only in some parallel version of Alaska, where different decisions had been made, where facilities had remained open, where people who had died in my world continued to live and work. I retired from long-haul trucking in 2024, taking a job with a local delivery company that keeps me close to Anchorage and away from the remote routes where impossible things happen. But I still think about Northern Research Station Alpha, about Dr. Sarah Mitchell and her research team, about the important work they were conducting in a facility that officially didn't exist. Sometimes I wonder if they're still there, still making advances in renewable energy technology that could help solve the world's climate crisis, still waiting for deliveries of equipment and supplies that might never come because the official world has forgotten they exist. And sometimes I wonder if the real tragedy isn't that I experienced something impossible, but that something important and valuable continues to operate in isolation, cut off from the support and recognition it deserves, because bureaucratic reality has declared it non-existent. The Alaska wilderness is vast enough to hide secrets, remote enough to allow anomalies, harsh enough to create conditions where normal rules break down. Maybe Northern Research Station Alpha exists in one of those hidden places, continuing its work despite official abandonment, waiting for the occasional delivery driver who can somehow find his way through the gaps in reality to bring them what they need. Or maybe I've been making deliveries to ghosts, helping the spirits of dedicated researchers continue their work even after death, facilitating science that transcends the boundaries between the living and the dead. In a place as extreme and unforgiving as Alaska, where survival depends on determination and stubbornness that borders on the supernatural, maybe death itself isn't enough to stop people from completing their missions. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, with the knowledge that I experience something that doesn't fit into any rational framework I understand. It's changed how I think about reality, about the relationship between official records and actual truth, about the possibility that important work might be happening in places and ways that the bureaucratic world doesn't recognize or acknowledge. The delivery receipts are still in my files, signed by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, dated with impossible dates, stamped with authorization codes that the government claims don't exist. The photographs I took sometimes show the active facility clearly, other times show nothing but empty wilderness. The GPS coordinates remain constant, but they lead to different destinations depending on factors I can't identify or predict. I've shown the evidence to friends, family members, and former colleagues. Some believe my account, others suggest I seek professional help. Most prefer not to discuss it at all, uncomfortable with questions that don't have satisfactory answers. But the evidence exists, tangible proof that something happened even if no one can explain what it was. 3 years after my first encounter with Northern Research Station Alpha, I received a phone call that brought the mystery full circle. The caller identified himself as Agent Martinez from the Department of Energy Inspector General's office, the same office that had investigated and then closed the fraud case related to the facility. Mr. Peterson, I need to ask you some questions about deliveries you made to Northern Research Station Alpha between 2023 and 2024. We're reopening our investigation based on new information that's come to light. Agent Martinez wanted to meet in person, saying that the matter involved classified information that couldn't be discussed over the phone. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Anchorage, a public location where we could talk without attracting attention. Martinez turned out to be a man in his 50s, with the careful manner and conservative dress of a career government investigator. He carried a briefcase full of documents and a digital recorder for taking notes. After checking my identification and confirming basic details about my employment history, he got straight to the point. "Mr. Peterson, our investigation has revealed that you made several deliveries to a facility claiming to be Northern Research Station Alpha, despite the fact that this facility was officially decommissioned in 2009. Can you describe these encounters in detail?" I told him everything I could remember, from the first delivery in November 2023 to my final visit in 2024. Martinez listened without interruption, taking occasional notes and asking for clarification on specific details. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes, reviewing his notes. "Mr. Peterson, what I'm about to tell you is classified information that you are not authorized to share with anyone. Do you understand the legal implications of that restriction?" I said I understood, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear information that would further complicate an already impossible situation. "Northern Research Station Alpha was not entirely shut down in 2009, Martinez continued. A portion of the facility's research was transferred to a classified program that continues to operate under different authorization and funding mechanisms. The official closure was a cover story designed to reduce public attention and congressional oversight. That explained some of the discrepancies I'd encountered, but it raised new questions about why the facility sometimes appeared to be abandoned and sometimes appeared to be active. The classified program operates on an irregular schedule, Martinez explained. Personnel and equipment are moved to the site only when specific research activities require the unique environmental conditions available at that location. Between these operational periods, the facility appears to be abandoned. "But I met Dr. Sarah Mitchell," I said. "According to public records, she died in 2011. Martinez consulted his notes. Dr. Mitchell's death was also part of the cover story. She was relocated and provided with a new identity to protect the classified nature of her research. The woman you met was indeed Dr. Sarah Mitchell, operating under special authorization to continue her renewable energy work." The explanation was plausible, but it didn't account for all the anomalies I'd experienced. The facility I'd visited had seemed to exist independently of any government operation, with personnel who genuinely believed they had been working there continuously since 2008. "Agent Martinez, why are you telling me this now? Why reopen an investigation that was closed 3 years ago?" Martinez hesitated before answering. "Because Dr. Mitchell and her research team have disappeared. The last authorized operation at Northern Research Station Alpha was concluded in 2022. Since then, the facility should have been completely inactive. But we've continued to receive reports of deliveries, payments, and research activities that we didn't authorize." He showed me a series of documents detailing unauthorized activities at the facility, deliveries from multiple vendors, payments from government accounts that should have been closed, research publications submitted to scientific journals using the facility's address. All of it occurring after the classified program had officially ended. We believe that Dr. Mitchell and her team may have continued their research without authorization, using the facility's infrastructure and identity to maintain their operations. This represents a serious security breach and potential violation of federal law. Or, I said, maybe they're operating in some version of reality where the program was never shut down. Martinez looked at me sharply. "Mr. Peterson, are you suggesting that supernatural forces are involved in this situation?" I told him about the inconsistent experiences I'd had at the facility, the way it sometimes appeared active and sometimes abandoned, the photographs that showed different things on different visits. Martinez listened with growing concern, taking detailed notes about every anomaly I described. "Mr. Peterson, I need to ask you to accompany me to Northern Research Station Alpha. We're conducting a formal investigation of the site, and your familiarity with the location could be valuable." I wasn't enthusiastic about returning to a place that had already caused me so much confusion and uncertainty. But I was curious to see what an official government investigation would find, and I hoped that Martinez might be able to provide explanations for the things I'd experienced. We drove to the site in a government vehicle equipped with sophisticated communication and navigation equipment. Martinez had a team of investigators waiting at the facility, along with Department of Energy security personnel and technical specialists. It was the most official attention the location had received since its original closure. When we arrived at the GPS coordinates, we found the abandoned site exactly as I'd seen it during some of my previous visits. Overgrown concrete foundations, rusted infrastructure, obvious signs of long-term abandonment. No buildings, no vehicles, no personnel. Just wilderness, slowly reclaiming what had once been a significant research facility. Martinez and his team spent 6 hours conducting a thorough investigation of the site. They used ground-penetrating radar to map the original building foundations, metal detectors to locate buried equipment, and electromagnetic sensors to identify any hidden electrical systems. They found evidence of the original facility's construction and operation, but nothing to suggest any recent activity. "There's no indication that anyone has been here in years," Martinez told me as his team packed up their equipment. "No fresh tire tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence of ongoing operations." But I knew they were looking in the wrong place, or at the wrong time, or in the wrong version of reality. The active facility I'd visited existed, but it wasn't necessarily accessible through normal investigative methods. "Agent Martinez," I said, "what if the facility exists but operates according to different rules than you're expecting? What if Dr. Mitchell and her team found a way to continue their research outside the normal constraints of time and space?" Martinez looked at me with the expression of a man who was beginning to question his own understanding of how the world works. "Mr. Peterson, are you seriously suggesting that a government research facility is operating in some kind of parallel dimension?" "I'm suggesting that Alaska is a place where impossible things happen regularly," I said. "Where the isolation and extreme conditions create environments where normal rules don't always apply. Maybe Dr. Mitchell's research led her to discoveries that changed her relationship with reality itself." Martinez didn't respond immediately. He stood at the edge of the abandoned site, looking out into the forest where I'd found the active facility during some of my visits. Finally, he asked me to show him the exact route I'd taken to reach the operational buildings. I led him along the path I remembered, though it was barely visible in the failing light. We walked for about 20 minutes through increasingly dense forest, following what might have been an old game trail or the remains of a long abandoned access road. As we walked, Martinez told me more about Dr. Mitchell's research and the classified program that had continued her work after the official closure. The renewable energy technologies she'd developed had potential applications far beyond what was publicly known, including experimental systems that challenged conventional understanding of energy conservation and thermodynamics. Some of her theoretical work suggested that energy could be extracted from temporal differentials, Martinez explained. The idea was that small differences in the flow of time between adjacent locations could be harnessed to generate usable power. Time flows differently in different places? According to Dr. Mitchell's research, yes. The effect is normally too small to measure or exploit, but under certain conditions, extreme isolation, specific electromagnetic environments, unusual geological formations, the differential can become significant enough to detect and potentially utilize. We emerged into a clearing that I recognized as the location where I'd found the active facility during some of my visits. But there was nothing there now except wilderness, no signs that any human activity had ever taken place in the area. Martinez used a handheld device to take readings of electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, and other environmental factors. The device showed several unusual readings, including fluctuations in what Martinez described as temporal field density.
"This is very strange," he said, studying the readouts. "The instruments are detecting anomalies consistent with Dr. Mitchell's theoretical predictions about temporal energy differentials. It's as if this location exists at a slightly different rate of time flow than the surrounding area." As we stood there discussing the readings, the sun set completely and darkness fell over the forest. That's when I noticed something that made my heart rate spike. Lights appearing through the trees exactly where the active facility should be located. "Agent Martinez," I said quietly, "do you see that?" He looked in the direction I was pointing and froze. Electric lights were clearly visible about 100 yards away, appearing and disappearing between the trees as if they were partially obscured by buildings that we couldn't see. We walked toward the lights, following the same path I'd used during my deliveries to the facility. As we got closer, I could hear the familiar sounds of an active research station, diesel generators, ventilation systems, vehicles moving around the compound. But when we reached the location where the lights appeared to be coming from, there was nothing there. Just forest, exactly as we'd left it. The lights were still visible from other angles, but they seemed to be coming from a source that didn't exist in the same physical space we were occupying. Martinez was taking continuous readings with his instruments, which showed increasingly dramatic anomalies as we moved around the area. "Mr. Peterson, according to these measurements, we're standing in the middle of a significant temporal displacement field. It's as if multiple versions of this location are existing simultaneously, separated by small differences in time flow." I asked him what that meant in practical terms. Martinez consulted his instruments and the notes he'd taken during our investigation. "I think Dr. Mitchell's research led her to discover something that allowed her facility to exist partially outside normal time," he said. "The operational periods that we authorized may have created a temporal bubble that continued to exist even after we officially ended the program. So the facility is still operating, but in a different time stream? Something like that. The people and equipment exist. They're conducting real research and processing real deliveries, but they're doing it in a version of reality that's slightly offset from our own. That would explain the inconsistent experiences I'd had at the facility, the way it sometimes appeared active and sometimes abandoned depending on unknown factors. It might also explain why Dr. Mitchell seemed unaware that her program had been officially terminated. From her perspective, the termination might never have occurred. We spent another hour in the area, documenting the anomalies and trying to establish communication with whatever existed in the temporal displacement field. Martinez had brought radio equipment tuned to frequencies that Dr. Mitchell's team had used during their authorized operations, but we received no response to our attempts at contact. As we prepared to leave, Martinez told me that his investigation would be classified at the highest levels, and that I would not be permitted to discuss it with anyone. The official report would conclude that no unauthorized activities had taken place at Northern Research Station Alpha, and that all previous reports of anomalous deliveries had been the result of administrative errors. "What about Dr. Mitchell and her team?" I asked. "Are you just going to leave them trapped in their temporal bubble?" Martinez was quiet for a long moment, consulting his instruments one final time. "Mr. Peterson, according to my readings, Dr. Mitchell's facility isn't trapped. It's exactly where and when it's supposed to be, conducting research that may be more important than any of us realized. The temporal displacement isn't a malfunction. It's a feature." "A feature of what?" "Of a research program that discovered something so significant that it created its own reality to protect and continue the work. Dr. Mitchell and her team aren't lost in time. They've found a way to exist outside the political and bureaucratic constraints that were shutting down their research." That was the last conversation I had with Agent Martinez. True to his word, the official investigation was classified and all records of my deliveries to Northern Research Station Alpha were removed from government databases.
Arctic Supply Lines was instructed to treat the entire matter as a closed administrative issue with no ongoing implications. But I know what I experienced, and I know it was real. Somewhere in the Alaska wilderness, in a temporal bubble created by scientific research that transcended the normal boundaries of reality, Dr. Sarah Mitchell and her team continue their work on renewable energy technologies that could change the world. They're still there, still conducting experiments, still making breakthroughs that might solve humanity's energy crisis. And occasionally, when the temporal fields align correctly, and a delivery driver finds himself in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, they receive the equipment and supplies they need to continue their impossible mission. I don't make long-haul deliveries anymore, but I still drive past that turnoff sometimes on my way to local jobs. The sign is never there when I look for it, but sometimes I catch a glimpse of it in my peripheral vision. Northern Research Station Alpha, active research facility, authorized personnel only. And sometimes, just sometimes, I consider taking that turn off one more time. Not to deliver cargo, but just to check on Dr. Mitchell and her team, to see how their research is progressing, to let them know that someone in the normal world remembers their work and values their dedication. But I don't. Because some deliveries are meant to be final, some destinations are meant to be found only once, and some secrets are meant to be kept by the drivers who were trusted to deliver them. The Alaska wilderness keeps its own schedule, follows its own rules, and protects its own secrets. And in that vast, unforgiving landscape where time moves differently and reality bends around the determination of people who refuse to give up, important work continues in places that officially don't exist. Dr. Sarah Mitchell is still out there, still making her discoveries, still signing for deliveries that shouldn't be possible, and that's exactly where she's supposed to be.